You get $20, old man, my son. Tyson smirked, flicking a crisp Jackson across the heavy mahogany table. His wife Courtney was already browsing luxury yachts on her tablet, ready to inherit my late ex-wife's $200 million fortune. I simply picked up the bill, folded it neatly, and waited for the lawyer to turn the page. By the time he finished reading, Tyson was no longer smiling. I am Anton, 68 years old, and this is the story of how my greedy son thought he could discard me, not realizing I held the keys to his entire world. Before I get into the details of this brutal awakening, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not inherited. The air in Mr. Kaplan's downtown Chicago office was thick with the smell of expensive leather and Tyson's overwhelming arrogance. Josephine, my ex-wife and a titan of the tech and real estate world, had passed away 3 weeks ago. Now it was time for the reading of the will. Tyson sat across from me in a tailored suit. He could not actually afford his leg bouncing with impatient greed. Courtney sat beside him, snapping her chewing gum loudly, her designer purse resting on the polished wood. When Kaplan read the first stipulation, leaving me exactly $20, Tyson let out a harsh bark of laughter. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious joy. He told me I should take that $20 and buy myself a decent meal before he kicked me to the curb. He said he knew all about my little jazz cafe on the south side and announced he was going to sell the building by the end of the month to cover his massive cryptocurrency losses. He called my sanctuary a worthless dump. Courtney chimed in, her voice dripping with fake pity. She said it was time for the parasite to finally get a real job now that his sugar mama was gone. She accused me of riding Josephine's coattails for decades, living off her scraps, while pretending to be a proud business owner. Tyson added that I was pathetic, a broke old man who contributed nothing to their empire and embarrassed him in front of his wealthy friends. They sat there, dissecting my dignity, completely unaware of the gravity of the room. They thought I was a helpless senior citizen about to be thrown onto the street. Kaplan paused, looking over his spectacles at me. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I just sat perfectly still, holding that $20 bill. Tyson and Courtney saw a humiliating insult in that $20 bill. I saw a 40-year-old promise. My silence was not submission. It was strategy. Josephine and I had divorced 15 years ago on paper, mostly to protect her corporate assets from the vicious lawsuits that plagued her industry. But we never stopped being partners. We built that empire together from nothing. 40 years ago, we were just two hungry kids sitting on a milk crate in a freezing Chicago apartment. We had exactly $20 between us. Josephine looked at me that night, terrified of the future, and I handed her that 20. I told her we were going to build a fortress, and no matter how high we climbed, that $20 would always be our anchor. It was our code. Over the decades, while Josephine became the public face of the company, securing magazine covers and conducting high-profile interviews, I handled the shadows. I built the logistics, secured the hidden accounts, and mapped out the fail-safes. I preferred the quiet rhythm of my jazz cafe to the ruthless noise of the boardroom. But Josephine knew who actually held the foundation together. Leaving me exactly $20 in the first paragraph of her will was not a dismissal. It was a flare fired into the night sky. It was Josephine telling me from beyond the grave that the vultures were circling and it was time for me to step out of the shadows and take control. I let Tyson continue his rant. He bragged about how he was going to liquidate the tech startup divisions, fire the legacy employees, and buy a penthouse in Dubai. I watched his jaw work, noting the desperation behind his arrogant eyes. I knew about the $3 million he owed to unregulated lenders. I knew about Courtney's secret spending habits and her mounting credit card debts. I had spent my entire life evaluating human weakness, and my son was tragically full of it. I slowly smoothed the $20 bill flat on the table, feeling the familiar texture of the paper. I was gathering data, letting them expose their complete lack of financial literacy and moral character. Let them think they had won. Let them revel in their cruel victory. The higher they inflated their egos, the harder the fall would be. I gave Mr. Kaplan a slow, deliberate nod. It was the signal. Kaplan cleared his throat, the sound echoing sharply in the large office. He adjusted his tie and informed Tyson that there was a second page to the directive. Tyson rolled his eyes, waving his hand dismissively, telling the lawyer to hurry up and give him the account routing numbers so he could leave. Courtney leaned in, practically salivating at the thought of the $200 million finally entering their joint account. Kaplan began to read the final binding clause of the trust. He stated that the entire estate, all liquid assets, property deeds, and corporate voting rights were indeed left to Tyson. Tyson pumped his fist in the air, but Kaplan raised a hand to silence him. The lawyer continued, his voice dropping to a serious, ironclad tone. He read that Tyson would inherit the fortune under one absolute non-negotiable condition. The entire $200 million estate was placed into a restrictive trust, and the sole trustee, the only person with the legal authority to approve any sale release, any funds, or authorize any corporate decision, was Anton Ellis. I had absolute veto power over every single penny until the day I died. The silence that hit the room was suffocating. Courtney dropped her tablet, the screen cracking violently against the hardwood floor. Tyson's smug expression evaporated, replaced by a sickly ghost-white pallor. The realization hit him like a freight train. He owned everything in name, but he could not buy a cup of coffee without my signature. I folded the $20 bill and slipped it into my breast pocket. I looked at my son, my face an unreadable mask. Tyson let out a sound that was half scream and half roar. He vaulted out of his leather chair, kicking the heavy mahogany table aside, and lunged straight across the room, right at my throat. Tyson never made it across the mahogany table. Mr. Kaplan pressed a hidden button beneath his desk, and two massive security contractors stepped out from the adjoining room, pinning my son against the leather chairs before his hands could even graze my collar. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and walked out of the office without looking back. Let him choke on his own rage. I knew the real war was just beginning. The very next morning, the bell above the door of my jazz cafe chimed. It was barely 6 o'clock. The morning mist was still clinging to the Chicago streets, and I was in the middle of roasting a fresh batch of Ethiopian coffee beans. I did not need to turn around to know trouble had arrived. Heavy boots stomped onto the vintage hardwood floor, shattering the morning peace. I wiped my hands on my apron and turned to face 5 men wearing cheap tactical suits. Standing right behind them, holding a designer coffee cup and wearing a smug, practiced smile, was Courtney. She marched straight up to the counter and slapped a thick stack of legal papers right next to my cash register. The document was stamped with a red emergency seal. She announced loudly that it was a court-ordered medical proxy. According to a private physician she had conveniently hired the night before, I was suffering from rapid onset dementia and severe cognitive decline. She claimed my mind was gone. My memory was fractured, and I was legally unfit to manage my own finances, let alone serve as the sole trustee of a $200 million empire. She told her thugs to tear the place apart. They were looking for the trust ledgers, the corporate seals, and any physical documents tying me to Josephine's estate. The men immediately went to work. They ripped vintage jazz posters off the drywall. They kicked over tables and emptied filing cabinets, scattering decades of meaningless receipts and sheet music across the floor. Courtney leaned against the counter, tapping her manicured fingernails against the wood. She told me to sit down in the corner like a good little patient and wait for the orderly to come collect me. She said it was a tragedy how fast the elderly lose their grip on reality. I did not argue. I did not yell about my rights or threaten to call my lawyer. Anger is a predictable emotion, and I never give my enemies what they predict. Instead, I turned my back to her and calmly began brewing a shot of espresso. The loud hiss of the steam wand masked the sound of her goons breaking the hinges off my office door. Courtney thought I was just a broken barista, an old man hiding in a coffee shop because the real world was too fast for him. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Long before Josephine and I lived in high-rise penthouses, I ran the logistical operations for the roughest transit unions on the south side of Chicago. You did not survive those underground negotiation rooms by throwing tantrums. You survived by building backdoors and anticipating betrayal before it even crossed your enemy's mind. Securing high-value assets was not a hobby for me. It was a reflex. While the thugs grunted and sweated, tearing through the floorboards of my back office, I kept my hands busy at the espresso machine. Built directly into the stainless steel drip tray, completely invisible to the naked eye, was a biometric scanner. I pressed my right thumb against the cool metal. Above the counter, hidden behind a digital menu board displaying the daily specials, a secure terminal booted up. I typed a sequence of commands on a modified keypad tucked beneath the cash drawer. With a few swift keystrokes, I initiated the ghost protocol I had designed months ago. I was silently migrating the master ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the core operational access codes of the entire estate to a decentralized encrypted server located in Geneva. I watched the progress bar hit 100% just as I finished pouring the dark espresso into a ceramic cup. The physical documents Courtney was desperately tearing my shop apart to find were nothing but decoys. The real power had just evaporated into the digital cloud, accessible only by a sequence of numbers stored purely inside my fully functioning, razor-sharp brain. I turned around and slid the espresso across the counter toward her. I told her it looked like she had a long morning ahead of her. A shout rang out from the back office. The lead security contractor emerged, wiping sweat from his forehead. He told Courtney they had used a thermal lance to crack the heavy iron safe I kept bolted to the floor in the storage room. Courtney pushed past him, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She stepped into the back room, expecting to find stacks of bearer bonds and the original trust documents. Instead, she found a rusted saxophone mouthpiece and a thick layer of dust. The safe was completely empty. Courtney froze. The smugness drained from her face, replaced by a dark, twisting fury. She looked at the empty safe, then slowly turned to look at me standing calmly by the espresso machine. In that exact second, she realized she had not cornered a helpless old man. She realized I had outsmarted her before she even walked through the door. Her legal proxy was useless if she could not locate the assets to seize them. But a desperate woman is a dangerous creature. If she could not take the documents by force, she would pivot to character assassination. She walked out of the back room, her breathing heavy and erratic. She grabbed a display rack holding 24 heavy ceramic mugs and violently shoved it over. The mugs crashed to the floor, shattering into hundreds of razor-sharp pieces. She reached up with both hands and aggressively tore at her own hair, messing it up until she looked unhinged. She ripped the top button off her expensive silk blouse. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I watched her entire demeanor shift in a matter of seconds. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Courtney let out a terrified, blood-curdling scream. She dropped to her knees among the broken ceramics, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. She told the dispatcher that her elderly father-in-law was having a violent schizophrenic breakdown. She claimed I had completely destroyed the cafe, embezzled millions in company assets, and was currently cornering her with a weapon. She begged them to send armed officers immediately because she feared for her life. She hung up the phone, wiped a fake tear from her cheek, and gave me a cold, dead smile. Outside, the wail of police sirens began to echo down the avenue, growing louder by the second. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the morning mist, illuminating the shattered ceramics inside my cafe. 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt, blocking the narrow street. Officers swarmed through the broken door with their weapons drawn, shouting aggressive commands for me to drop to the floor. I complied silently, placing my hands behind my back as the cold steel of the handcuffs bit deeply into my wrists. They hauled me up roughly and marched me out of my own sanctuary. The morning commuters and the neighboring business owners, people I had served coffee to for years, had gathered on the sidewalk. They whispered and pointed as I was shoved without care into the back of a squad car. By the entrance, Courtney was sobbing into a paramedic's shoulder, clutching her chest and playing the traumatized victim flawlessly. I kept my chin high, my face completely devoid of emotion. The ride to the precinct was a chaotic blur of city streets and crackling police radios. Once inside the station, they stripped me of my belt, my shoelaces, and my dignity, locking me in a bleak concrete holding cell. Hours ticked by slowly. The smell of stale sweat, rust, and cheap disinfectant filled the stagnant air. Finally, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor echoed as it unlocked. It was not a detective coming to interrogate me, it was my son. Tyson walked into the holding area wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every bit the concerned, heartbroken child visiting his deranged father. He stood on the other side of the iron bars, shaking his head with manufactured sorrow. He told me it did not have to be this ugly. He claimed Courtney was terrified for her life but willing to drop all the criminal charges and cancel the psychological evaluation order immediately. All I had to do was sign a single piece of paper transferring my trustee rights over to him permanently. He slid a crisp, newly printed legal document through the bars, along with a sleek silver pen. He promised that once I signed the paper, he would take me out of this filthy cell and place me in a nice, comfortable retirement home where I could rest my tired mind. He thought he was offering me a generous lifeline. He genuinely believed the public humiliation of the handcuffs and the cold reality of the jail cell had broken my spirit. He leaned his shoulder against the iron bars, waiting for me to eagerly grab the pen and surrender everything Josephine and I had built. I did not look at the pen on the floor. I looked straight into his hollow, greedy eyes. I told him he was wearing a very expensive suit for a man who was quietly drowning in unregulated debt. His confident smile faltered just a fraction of an inch, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway. I told him I did not need his fake pity, and I certainly did not need his coercive legal document. I turned my back on him and sat down heavily on the solid steel bench attached to the concrete wall. What my arrogant son did not understand was that real power never comes from screaming the loudest or throwing the first punch. Real power is completely silent, deeply rooted, and built on decades of carefully managed leverage. I was not just another nameless, helpless old man sitting in a precinct holding cell waiting to be processed by the system. 20 years ago, long before Josephine and I moved into the upper echelons of Chicago high society, I ran the rough streets. I managed the money, the supply lines, and the men who built the city skyline. During that violent era, a young, desperate beat cop came to me. His father had foolishly borrowed $50,000 from a brutal Russian syndicate to keep a failing neighborhood grocery store afloat. The syndicate was threatening to take the old man's life and permanently ruin the young cop's pristine career. That cop had absolutely nowhere to turn. He sat at a back table in my jazz cafe, weeping quietly over a cup of black coffee. I did not lend him the money. I took cash from my own logistics vault, paid the syndicate off entirely in one night, and wiped the slate totally clean. I told that young officer to keep his nose clean, rise through the ranks, and never forget who gave his family a second chance at survival. I never asked for a single favor in return, not for 2 entire decades. But when the booking officer had processed my fingerprints earlier that morning and offered me my one legally mandated phone call, I did not call my attorney Mr. Kaplan. I called a private, highly unlisted mobile number. I told the familiar voice on the other end of the line that the 20-year grace period was officially over. So as Tyson stood outside my cell, aggressively tapping the silver pen against the iron bars and threatening me with a state-mandated psychiatric hold, I simply closed my eyes and waited in the silence. I knew something he did not. I knew the invisible architecture of this city. I knew that the man who now sat behind the massive oak desk on the top floor of this very precinct was that exact same young cop I had saved 20 years prior. I was not trapped in Tyson's cage. I was entirely on my own turf. The heavy security door at the end of the corridor slammed open, echoing down the cell block like a gunshot. Heavy, authoritative footsteps marched rapidly down the hallway. Tyson stepped back from the bars, clearly annoyed by the interruption, expecting a lowly deputy to come process my transfer paperwork. Instead, a towering man covered in brass stars and gold braids stopped right in front of my cell. It was the chief of police. He completely ignored Tyson. He looked straight at me, gave a firm, deeply respectful nod, and ordered the desk sergeant to open the cell immediately. The heavy iron door slid open with a loud metallic screech. The chief stepped inside the cell and personally handed me back my belt and my shoelaces. Tyson began stammering loudly, demanding to know what was going on. He pointed a shaking finger at me, shouting that I was a dangerous schizophrenic who had destroyed a business and violently threatened his wife. The chief slowly turned his massive frame to face my son. He pulled Courtney's sworn complaint out of his uniform pocket and tore it precisely in half. Then he tore it again, letting the shredded pieces flutter onto the dirty concrete floor. The chief stepped directly into Tyson's personal space, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. He informed Tyson that as of 10 minutes ago, all criminal charges against me had been completely expunged from the system. Furthermore, the chief stated that the Financial Crimes Division had just received an anonymous, highly detailed tip regarding Tyson's recent commercial insurance claims. A full forensic audit had already been authorized by a federal judge. Detectives were currently on their way to Tyson's downtown office to seize his hard drives and investigate 3 highly suspicious warehouse fires tied directly to his shell companies. Tyson's face went completely pale, draining of all blood. The silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the floor. He looked at the chief and then he looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying clarity. He finally realized he had not trapped a helpless victim. He had walked straight into a cage with an apex predator. I methodically buttoned my cuffs, walked past my paralyzed son, and headed for the precinct exit. Stripping him of his legal leverage was only the first step. Deprived of the police and the courts, Courtney would now act out of pure desperation, and a desperate woman would inevitably use her most valuable asset as a weapon. She was going to use my grandson. By the time I walked out of the precinct, the crisp morning air felt like a cleansing breath. I had successfully stripped my son of his police protection and turned the Financial Crimes Division loose on his fraudulent business operations. But I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Cornering a desperate rat only guarantees it will bare its teeth and strike at whatever is closest. Courtney was not a brilliant strategist, but she possessed the kind of reckless, toxic malice that made her deeply unpredictable. When she realized the police were no longer her personal attack dogs and that Tyson was rapidly sinking under the weight of a federal audit, she abandoned the legal battlefield entirely. She pivoted to the one arena where she still held absolute terrifying control. She weaponized my 8-year-old grandson. The phone call came at exactly 2 in the afternoon. I was standing in the ruined shell of my cafe, methodically sweeping up the broken ceramics and shattered glass when my secure line rang. It was Courtney. Gone was the hysterical, weeping victim she had played so perfectly for the paramedics outside my shop. Her voice was pure, unadulterated venom. She informed me that she had pulled Leo out of his private school halfway through the day. She had packed his bags, confiscated his electronic devices, and legally barred my name from his emergency contact list at every local hospital and facility. I would never see my grandson again. Unless, of course, I met her new, non-negotiable terms. She demanded I immediately authorize a $50 million wire transfer to a numbered, untraceable account in the Cayman Islands by midnight. If I refused, or if I tried to involve my lawyer to block the move, she promised to put Leo on a private charter flight to a non-extradition country before the sun came up. She laughed coldly into the receiver, stating that Tyson was a weak, useless fool who was going to take the fall for the commercial insurance fraud, but she had absolutely no intention of going down with him. She told me to think very carefully about how much my grandson's future and safety were worth to me. Then she hung up, leaving a dead, hollow dial tone ringing in my ear. She thought she had found the ultimate leverage. She truly believed that threatening the only piece of my bloodline I actually cared about would force me to panic and blindly hand over the keys to the empire. I did not throw my phone across the room. I did not scream at the walls or immediately call my bank to authorize the massive transfer. I calmly placed the phone in my pocket, picked up my broom, and continued sweeping the floor. I was calculating the variables. Courtney was panicking, and panic breeds severe miscalculations. $50 million was a very specific number, far more than she needed to simply escape the country and live comfortably on a beach. It was a targeted payoff number. She was running from a debt or a shadow much larger than Tyson's failing shell companies. Her desperation meant she was acting on impulse, and impulsive people always leave a sloppy trail. I knew Courtney's psychological profile too well. She was way too paranoid to actually take a child through international customs while her husband was under active federal investigation. She would need to stash the boy somewhere highly secure while she finalized her escape route and secured her fake passports. I put away the broom, locked the shattered front doors of the cafe, and drove my vintage sedan directly toward Leo's private academy. I parked 3 blocks away, carefully avoiding the main security cameras positioned at the gates. I knew Leo's daily schedule intimately. I knew that every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, his physical education teacher, Mr. Henderson, took the boys to the nearby public park for soccer practice. I also knew that Leo suffered from severe asthma, and Mr. Henderson always carried a spare emergency inhaler in a heavy red medical kit slung over his shoulder. I waited patiently by the park entrance, blending in with the afternoon foot traffic. When the boys ran out onto the field, I approached the teacher. I played the part of the concerned, slightly forgetful grandfather to perfection. I told Mr. Henderson I had brought Leo's updated prescription from the pharmacy and asked to place it directly into the medical kit myself to ensure the boy was safe. The teacher, knowing me well from years of attending school plays and parent meetings, warmly handed me the heavy red bag without a second thought. He turned his back for exactly 4 seconds to blow his whistle at a misbehaving student. That was all the time I needed. I did not just place a standard plastic inhaler into the bag. My decades managing the shadowy logistics of Chicago's transit unions had taught me exactly how to track high-value cargo without ever drawing the attention of the authorities. Inside the hard plastic casing of the fake inhaler was a micro GPS transmitter, a military-grade device originally designed for tracking armored transport vehicles. It ran on a kinetic battery completely undetectable by commercial security scanners, and it pinged a secure satellite every 10 seconds. I closed the medical kit, handed it back to the smiling teacher, and thanked him profusely for looking out for my grandson. I walked back to my car, my pulse perfectly steady and my mind clear. Courtney thought she could hide my bloodline from me. She had no idea she had just strapped a highly classified homing beacon directly to his chest. Now it was only a matter of waiting for the sun to go down and for her to make her next move. I sat in the dark, quiet study of my home, watching the glowing blue dot on my laptop screen. The clock on the mahogany wall ticked steadily toward midnight. The deadline for the $50 million wire transfer came and went. I had not moved a single cent. I kept my eyes locked relentlessly on the screen. For hours, the blue dot had remained stationary at Tyson and Courtney's sprawling suburban estate. But at exactly 12:15, the dot began to move. It traveled fast down the interstate, heading away from the city and, more importantly, heading far away from the international airport. Courtney was not fleeing the country tonight. She was moving in the shadows. I traced the exact coordinates as the dot exited the highway and plunged into a heavily wooded, isolated area in the northern suburbs. The dot finally stopped and remained completely still. I pulled up the satellite imagery and cross-referenced the exact geographical address with county property tax records. The location was not a hotel, a rented safe house, or a private airstrip. It was an unlisted, highly secured compound surrounded by 12-foot wrought iron fences and dense tree lines. It was registered under a subsidiary shell company as a private elite psychiatric facility. It was the kind of dark, off-the-books clinic where wealthy families quietly locked away their problematic relatives to avoid public scandals. A cold, heavy dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The puzzle pieces suddenly violently snapped together. Courtney was never planning to take Leo to Europe or the Caribbean. She was going to have her own 8-year-old son legally committed to a psychiatric ward. By having him declared mentally unstable and institutionalized under her sole legal guardianship, she could automatically trigger a hidden secondary medical trust fund Josephine had set up exclusively for the boy's lifelong care. She was perfectly willing to destroy a child's mind with heavy sedatives and lock him in a padded room just to bypass my authority as trustee and get her hands on the emergency cash. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed the keys to my car from the desk, and headed out into the freezing night. Courtney had crossed the final unforgivable line, and I was going to tear her world apart. The tires of my heavy vintage sedan chewed through the gravel driveway of the secluded compound, kicking up stones into the freezing night air. I had called Mr. Kaplan during the tense drive from the city, and my ruthless attorney was already waiting by the iron gates in his own sleek vehicle. We did not bother buzzing the intercom or waiting for permission to enter. I drove my car straight through the decorative wooden security barrier, blocking the service entrance, snapping it completely in half. We marched through the sliding glass doors of the clinic, ignoring the loud protests of the startled night receptionist. Kaplan immediately flashed a thick leather binder and threatened the woman with an instant federal obstruction charge if her hand even brushed the telephone. I did not wait for her compliance. My eyes scanned the digital directory glowing on the lobby wall, and I moved with the silent precision of a man who had spent his youth clearing hostile warehouses on the south side. We found room 204 at the very end of a sterile, heavily soundproofed hallway. The door was locked from the inside. I did not knock. I took a step back and kicked the heavy oak door open with enough force to splinter the frame. The scene inside made my blood run ice cold. My 8-year-old grandson Leo was strapped tightly to a cold medical bed by thick leather restraints, his small eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Standing directly over him was a man in a pristine white coat holding a large syringe filled with a thick, cloudy liquid. Courtney stood in the corner of the room with her arms crossed, tapping her designer shoe impatiently against the linoleum floor. She was harshly barking at the doctor to hurry up and administer the heavy sedative before the boy could start screaming again. They needed him heavily drugged and incoherent to fake a violent psychotic episode. That manufactured episode would provide the exact medical documentation Courtney required to legally crack open Josephine's secondary emergency health trust, bypassing my authority completely. The doctor jumped violently at the explosive sound of the door smashing against the wall. He lowered the needle, his face paling as Kaplan and I stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the room. Courtney gasped, taking a sudden step back until her shoulders hit the wall. She demanded to know how I had tracked them to an unlisted facility. I ignored her entirely. I walked straight up to the doctor, my gaze locked dead onto the syringe trembling in his hand. I told the man in the white coat to place the syringe on the stainless steel tray immediately. He tried to puff out his chest and assert his authority, claiming I was trespassing in a highly restricted medical facility and actively interfering with a prescribed psychiatric treatment. He threatened to call the armed guards patrolling the grounds. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen twice and held it up so the doctor could clearly see the high-definition video playing. During the chaotic raid on my jazz cafe yesterday morning, while Courtney was busy directing her hired thugs to tear up my floorboards and smash my ceramics, she thought she was completely unobserved. But my hidden security cameras had recorded every single movement in the room from 3 different angles. The footage on the screen was crystal clear. It showed Courtney standing behind my counter, reaching into her expensive purse and pulling out a small plastic bag. The camera zoomed in perfectly as she crushed 3 heavy prescription tranquilizers into fine powder and stirred them directly into the glass of orange juice she had just poured for Leo. She was systematically poisoning her own child to manufacture a documented history of erratic behavior. I watched the color completely drain from the corrupt doctor's face as the damning video looped flawlessly on the screen. I calmly explained to him that he was not treating a legitimate psychiatric patient. He was actively participating in severe child abuse, medical malpractice, and federal financial fraud. I told him my network had already pulled his background file. I knew his medical license had been suspended once before in another state for overprescribing heavy narcotics to wealthy, desperate housewives. Kaplan stepped forward, opening his leather binder with a sharp snap. My attorney informed the doctor that the video had already been securely transmitted to the state medical board and the district attorney's private server. However, Kaplan noted with a chilling calmness the prosecutor might be willing to offer full immunity to a cooperating medical witness who was simply deceived by a manipulative, wealthy mother. The choice was entirely his to make. He could either put the loaded syringe down and walk out of this room as a free man, or he could inject my grandson and spend the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security federal prison. The doctor looked over at Courtney, who was now screaming frantically at him to ignore us and finish the job. She aggressively promised to double his payout and buy him a new practice. But the doctor was looking at the cold, hard reality of my unblinking stare. He realized the wealthy woman screaming in the corner had absolutely no real power here. I was the one holding the hammer. The doctor swallowed hard, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the plastic tube. He slowly placed the loaded syringe onto the metal tray, the plastic clattering loudly in the quiet room. He backed away from the medical bed, his hands raised in total surrender, and practically sprinted out of the room, leaving Courtney completely defenseless. She let out a frustrated, animalistic shriek, grabbing her purse and charging toward the door to escape, but Kaplan casually shifted his weight and blocked her path. I walked over to the bed and quickly unbuckled the heavy leather restraints holding my grandson down. Leo sat up instantly, tears streaming down his face, and buried his face deep into my coat. I wrapped my arms around him, promising him in a soft voice that no one was ever going to hurt him again. I picked his small frame up, ready to carry him out of that house of horrors and take him home. But just as I turned toward the hallway, the doorway was suddenly blocked by a massive, imposing figure. It was Tyson. He was breathing heavily, his tie undone, flanked by 2 armed private security contractors and a uniformed court bailiff. He looked from the furious Courtney to me, holding his crying son, his eyes burning with a desperate, chaotic energy. He did not look like a relieved father who had come to rescue his boy from a rogue medical procedure. He looked like a man who had come to claim his most valuable piece of property. He held up a thick stack of papers stamped with the official blue seal of a federal family court judge. Tyson sneered, announcing loudly that the Financial Crimes Division might be auditing his businesses across town, but he was still the biological father and the sole legal guardian of the boy in my arms. He had used his remaining connections to wake up a judge in the middle of the night and secure an ironclad emergency physical custody order. The uniformed bailiff stepped forward, placing a hand on his holstered weapon, and formally ordered me to hand the child over to his father immediately. Tyson smiled a cruel, victorious smile, declaring that the legal custody war had officially begun, and I was totally powerless to stop him. He demanded I hand over the boy right that second or face immediate kidnapping charges. I tightened my protective grip on Leo, looking directly into my son's dead eyes. I looked at the uniformed bailiff, his hand resting securely on his weapon. I could have fought them. I could have broken Tyson's jaw right there in the sterile hallway. But assaulting an armed officer and violating a federal custody order would only guarantee I spent the rest of my life behind bars, leaving Leo completely at the mercy of these monsters. I knelt down, looking into my grandson's terrified eyes. I wiped the tears from his cheeks and promised him with absolute certainty that I would be coming back for him. I stood up and gently pushed the boy toward his father. Tyson snatched Leo by the arm with a victorious sneer, mocking me for finally backing down. He turned and marched down the hallway, dragging the crying child away while Courtney scrambled to follow them. I walked out into the freezing night, my mind already calculating the legal avenues to strip Tyson of his parental rights. But Tyson was not going to wait for a court battle. Humiliated by my constant interference and desperate to completely destroy my leverage, he decided to burn his mother's empire to the ground. The next morning, the financial news networks were in total chaos. Tyson had marched into the corporate headquarters at dawn and weaponized his title as chief executive officer. Furious that he could not touch the locked trust funds without my signature, he initiated a scorched earth protocol on the operational side of the business. He sent a single, ruthlessly short email terminating 500 legacy employees. These were the loyal engineers, the facility managers, and the administrative staff who had built the company alongside Josephine. He stripped them of their health insurance and canceled their pensions with the stroke of a pen. Within hours, Tyson began liquidating prime commercial real estate assets and highly valuable tech patents at massive, staggering losses. He was selling off multi-million-dollar properties in the heart of downtown Chicago for pennies on the dollar to anonymous holding groups. His strategy was brutal, transparent, and entirely malicious. If he could not inherit the $200 million fortune seamlessly, he was going to bankrupt the operational company entirely. He wanted to drain the lifeblood of the empire so fast that by the time I managed to secure a legal injunction, I would be the sole trustee of nothing but ashes, liabilities, and debt. Courtney stood by his side in the executive suite, encouraging his destructive rampage, convincing him that showing absolute dominance was the only way to break my spirit. I sat in the dim light of my home office, watching the stock ticker completely plummet on the television screen. My phone rang incessantly with panicked calls from board members, weeping employees, and fired executives begging me to intervene and stop the madness. I muted the television and placed my phone face down on the heavy oak desk. Let them panic. Let the stock drop. Tyson thought he was dealing a lethal blow by manipulating the corporate accounts from his glass corner office. He fundamentally misunderstood the architecture of the very company he was trying to destroy. When Josephine and I first incorporated the business 40 years ago, we did not have a massive department of cybersecurity experts or expensive cloud servers. We had a tiny rented room, a leaking radiator, and a handful of second-hand computer parts. While Josephine was out networking and securing our first clients, I personally wrote the original code for our internal network. I physically wired the first servers and designed the data flow matrix from scratch. Over the decades, the company had grown into a global titan. They had upgraded the software thousands of times, hired elite private security firms, and installed multi-million-dollar corporate firewalls to protect the infrastructure. But a fortress is only as secure as its foundation. And I was the man who poured the concrete. When I built the original architecture, I hard-coded a root access backdoor buried so deep within the core operating system that no modern cybersecurity scan could ever detect it. It was a digital skeleton key that bypassed every single firewall, biometric password, and security protocol the company currently utilized. I did not need to petition a judge for a corporate freeze or hire a team of forensic accountants to stop my son. I pushed my chair over to my secondary desk, powered up a highly modified custom-built rig I kept purely for emergencies, and began to type. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, entering strings of obsolete command codes that had not been used since the late 80s. The multi-million-dollar security wall Tyson was hiding behind did not even register a breach. Within exactly 4 minutes, I had absolute unhindered access to the main corporate server. I could see every email, every confidential memo, and every single financial transaction happening in real time. I watched the numbers flash across my screen as Tyson rapidly sold off another massive commercial property and authorized the immediate transfer of the funds. With root access secured, I immediately deployed a tracking algorithm to follow the massive bleed of corporate cash. Tyson was liquidating assets at an alarming rate, but the money had to be going somewhere. I initially assumed he was funneling the funds directly to the unregulated crypto lenders who were currently breathing down his neck. He owed them $3 million, and violent men do not wait patiently for their money. But as I traced the routing numbers through a complex maze of offshore banking layers, the final destination of the cash did not make any sense at all. The millions of dollars Tyson was bleeding from his mother's company were not going to his creditors to save his own life. The funds were being rapidly deposited into an obscure shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I ran a deep background search on the shell company's corporate officers, breaking through their privacy shields with my unrestricted server access. The company was not owned by crypto investors, Russian syndicates, or traditional loan sharks. The primary beneficiary of the shell company was the executive vice president of our own corporation. He was Tyson's trusted right-hand man, the very guy who had been advising him to liquidate the assets in the first place. I dug much deeper into the server, pulling the vice president's private corporate communications and cross-referencing them with his hidden expense accounts. I found hundreds of encrypted text messages, lavish hotel receipts, and private charter flight logs. The messages were sickeningly explicit. They detailed weekend getaways, expensive jewelry purchases, and mocking comments about Tyson's gullibility. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. The vice president was not just a corrupt executive stealing corporate funds for early retirement. He was Courtney's secret lover. Tyson, in his blind, arrogant fury to destroy my power, was rapidly bankrupting his own family empire and destroying his mother's legacy, completely unaware that he was personally funding his wife's illicit affair with his own second-in-command. They were playing my son for an absolute fool, bleeding him dry while he thought he was the one in control. I leaned back in my chair, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my face. They wanted to play corporate games. It was time to show up at Tyson's upcoming victory party and let the absolute truth burn his entire world to the ground. 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was bathed in the golden glow of 10,000 crystal chandeliers. Tyson had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate his supposed victory over me. He had authorized a staggering $500,000 corporate gala, draining even more lifeblood from the company's operating accounts. Waiters in crisp white coats circulated the massive room, carrying silver trays loaded with imported beluga caviar and rare vintage champagne. Massive, intricately carved ice sculptures shaped like the company logo dominated the extravagant buffet tables, slowly melting under the hot stage lights. It was a grotesque, sickening display of unearned wealth. Tyson was throwing a lavish victory parade on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. He stood near the center stage, completely surrounded by sycophants, corporate yes-men, and wealthy socialites wearing a custom-tailored velvet jacket that probably cost more than my first car. Courtney clung tightly to his arm, draped in heavy diamond necklaces that were undoubtedly paid for by the very legacy employees Tyson had ruthlessly fired earlier that week. They were laughing loudly, soaking in the false admiration of a shallow crowd that only cared about the free alcohol and the expensive networking opportunities. They genuinely thought I was hiding in my ruined house, mourning the loss of my grandson and the total destruction of my lifelong legacy. They believed the old man was finally broken. They were entirely wrong. I arrived at the gala exactly 30 minutes after the heavy brass doors opened to the public. I was not wearing the comfortable wool cardigans or the stained aprons of the jazz cafe owner they loved to mock. I pulled my vintage midnight blue tuxedo out of the protective garment bag, the exact same bespoke suit I wore when Josephine and I confidently rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange 2 decades ago. Looking in the mirror, I saw the true architect of the empire staring back. I carried absolutely nothing with me except a single perfectly sealed manila envelope. I stepped out of my parked car and walked deliberately toward the grand entrance, my posture rigid and my mind completely clear. The Chicago air was freezing, but I did not feel the cold. I only felt the absolute certainty of the destruction I was about to unleash upon them. The entrance to the opulent ballroom was heavily barricaded. Tyson had hired an elite private security firm to ensure I could not crash his perfect evening and ruin his moment of glory. 5 massive guards wearing tactical earpieces stood firmly behind the red velvet ropes, checking names against a glowing digital tablet. Tyson thought he was being clever, but his profound ignorance of our company history was his greatest weakness. He had simply hired the most expensive security contractor listed in the corporate directory. He never bothered to check who originally vetted and established the foundational contract with that exact firm 15 years ago. As I approached the velvet rope, the lead security director stepped forward aggressively. His hand instinctively hovered near his radio, fully prepared to turn away an uninvited guest. Then his eyes locked onto my face. This was a man I had personally retained when his security firm was just a struggling startup operating out of a garage. I had kept his entire business afloat during the severe economic recession by trusting him with our corporate accounts. The director immediately dropped his hand, stood up perfectly straight, and gave me a deep, highly respectful nod. He unclipped the heavy velvet rope himself and waved me right through the sensitive metal detectors without uttering a single question. I bypassed the heavily guarded perimeter, effortlessly slipping into the crowded ballroom like a phantom in the night. I did not head for the crowded bar or the extravagant buffet. I moved directly through the dark shadows of the room toward the elevated audiovisual control booth located at the back of the hall. The lead technician sitting at the soundboard was a loyal legacy employee Tyson had somehow missed during his chaotic firing frenzy. I quietly handed the young technician the manila envelope. Inside was a sleek black USB drive holding the decrypted server files. I told him to override the main video feed the exact moment Tyson raised his glass for the opening toast. I stood silently in the dark booth and watched my son confidently take the stage. Tyson grabbed the microphone, his voice echoing loudly over the massive surround sound speakers. He bragged endlessly about the bold new direction of the company. He talked enthusiastically about cutting the useless dead weight and securing a leaner, more aggressive financial future. He was indirectly mocking me to a room full of strangers. He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile at the flashing cameras. That was my cue. The technician pressed a single red button on the complex console. The massive 40-foot high-definition projection screen behind Tyson suddenly went pitch black. The corporate logo vanished entirely. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the massive crowd. A second later, the screen ignited with blinding white light. The entire room gasped in unison. Displayed in massive, unavoidable font were the precise ledgers of the offshore Cayman Island bank accounts. Every single dollar Tyson had blindly liquidated was shown funneling directly into the vice president's secret shell company. But the financial treason was only the appetizer. The screen abruptly shifted to the next slide. High-resolution, undeniably explicit photographs filled the 40-foot display. They were the hidden security images of Courtney and the vice president tangled together in a luxury hotel suite time-stamped just 3 days ago. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute and utterly deafening. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The only sound in the cavernous room was the sharp clinking of a single-dropped champagne flute shattering against the polished marble floor. Tyson froze completely rigid, his arms still raised high in the air for his celebratory toast. He slowly turned his head to look at the massive glowing screen directly behind him. The arrogant, victorious smile instantly melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He stared at the massive, indisputable images of his wife and his most trusted executive, the crushing reality of his ultimate betrayal washing over him in real time. The humiliation was total, absolute, and painfully public. Hundreds of cell phones were suddenly raised high into the air, eagerly recording the disastrous spectacle for the world to see. Tyson let out a primal, agonizing scream that tore through the quiet room. He dropped his microphone, his wild eyes locking onto Courtney, who was standing frozen near the edge of the stage, her face completely pale and trembling. Tyson lunged violently across the stage, diving straight toward his wife with his hands outstretched, fully intending to strangle her right in front of the city's elite. But before his shaking fingers could even brush her throat, the heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage violently parted. The vice president stepped out from the dark shadows. He was not panicking. He was not running from the explosive scandal. He walked with the calm, terrifying confidence of a man who had already won the war. Flanking him closely were 4 heavily armed private military contractors, ruthless men who answered only to his personal payroll. The guards moved with brutal efficiency, intercepting Tyson mid-air and slamming him face first into the hard wooden stage, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. The vice president calmly bent down, picked up the discarded microphone, and looked down at my struggling, weeping son. His voice echoed coldly across the silent ballroom. He announced to the shocked crowd that Tyson was officially no longer the chief executive officer of the company. He explained that amidst Tyson's frantic, reckless rush to liquidate the valuable corporate assets, earlier that week Tyson had hastily signed a thick stack of complex restructuring documents without ever reading the fine print. The vice president had legally manipulated Tyson into signing away exactly 51% of his controlling voting shares directly to the offshore holding group. The vice president proudly declared that he now owned the absolute majority stake, the company, and the entire fortune. He looked directly past the crowd, found me standing in the shadows at the back of the room, and smiled a wicked, challenging smile. My son had not just lost his wife and his dignity. He had handed the keys to the entire empire directly to my greatest enemy. The heavy security doors of the Drake Hotel were violently shoved open, and Tyson was physically thrown out into the freezing Chicago rain. The private military contractors did not care about his expensive custom velvet jacket or the fact that he was the chief executive officer just 10 minutes prior. They tossed him onto the wet pavement like bags of common garbage. I did not stay to watch him scrape his bruised face off the concrete. I had already slipped out through the service elevator, leaving the chaos of the grand ballroom far behind me. I drove back to the south side, back to the shattered remains of my jazz cafe. The physical damage from Courtney's raid was still evident, but the structure itself remained standing. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, turned on a single dim overhead lamp, and waited. I knew exactly where my son would go. When a man is completely stripped of his money, his wife, and his false power, he inevitably crawls back to the only foundation he has left. 2 hours later, the heavy fist started pounding against the cracked glass of my front door. It was well past midnight, and the storm had intensified into a torrential downpour. I walked to the front and unlocked the deadbolt. Tyson practically fell inside, bringing a rush of freezing wind and rainwater with him. He was a pathetic, ruined sight. His expensive suit was soaked through and torn at the shoulder. His face was pale, his hands were violently shaking, and his eyes were completely bloodshot from crying. He collapsed onto one of the wooden bar stools, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged me to help him. He confessed everything in a frantic, hyperventilating rush. He told me about the $3 million he owed to the unregulated crypto lenders, admitting that the men who held his debt were extremely violent and would not wait another day. He cried about Courtney's ultimate betrayal with his own vice president, whining that he had been played for an absolute fool. He pleaded with me to use my absolute power as the sole trustee to freeze the corporate accounts, reverse the hostile takeover, and give him enough cash from Josephine's estate to flee the country before his creditors found him. He looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes, expecting the warm embrace of a forgiving father. He expected me to wrap my arms around him, tell him everything was going to be all right, and write him a massive check to erase his terrible mistakes. I stood completely still on the other side of the counter, pouring a single cup of black coffee. I did not offer him a towel. I did not reach out to comfort him. I executed the silent adjustment. I looked down at my weeping son with a cold, unyielding gaze. I told him that arrogance is a heavy tax, and the consequences of paying it are strictly permanent. Tyson stared at me in shock, his mouth hanging slightly open. He asked me how I could be so incredibly heartless while his entire life was falling apart. I placed the coffee mug on the counter and leaned forward. I reminded him of a night 20 years ago when he was just a teenager. He had stolen a luxury sports car, crashed it into a city streetlight, and expected Josephine and me to simply buy his way out of a felony charge. Josephine had paid the massive fines to keep him out of jail, but I had forced him to work grueling shifts at the shipping docks for an entire summer to pay us back. Tyson had hated me for it. He never actually learned the lesson of accountability. He only learned how to hide his failures behind his mother's immense wealth and my silent protection. I told him that for his entire adult life he had operated under the pathetic delusion that he was a brilliant businessman while completely ignoring the fact that he was standing on a fortress we built. He had treated me like a parasite. He had laughed when I was left $20 in the will. He had conspired with a ruthless woman to lock my grandson in a psychiatric ward just to secure a quick payout. And now, because of his own blinding greed, he had handed the keys of a $200 million empire directly to a traitor. Tyson dropped to his knees on the wet floorboards, begging for just enough money to pay off the violent crypto lenders. He screamed that they were going to kill him if he did not deliver the cash by morning. I did not flinch. I told him firmly that the trust fund was designed to protect Josephine's legacy and secure my grandson's future. It was absolutely not a bailout fund for arrogant traders who gambled away their birthright. I refused to give him a single dime. I told him he needed to stand up, walk out the door, and face the men he owed money to like an adult. Tyson looked at me with a mixture of profound terror and absolute hatred. He slowly stood up, realizing that the protective shield I had provided his entire life was permanently gone. He turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, completely alone in the world. Before Tyson could push the heavy door open, the landline phone on the cafe wall began to ring loudly. The shrill sound cut through the heavy silence of the room. I walked over and picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was smooth, highly educated, and dripping with smug satisfaction. It was the vice president. He did not call to gloat about humiliating Tyson at the gala. He was calling because he had hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall. He calmly explained that he had successfully secured Tyson's 51% voting shares and completely locked down the corporate board. He had the executive power, but he lacked the fundamental financial control. He revealed a complex legal loophole that was currently ruining his entire hostile takeover. Because the core operational assets and the primary company patents were permanently tied to the overarching trust fund established by Josephine, the vice president could not fully liquidate the company or merge it with his Cayman Island Shell Corporation. He could not access the actual $200 million. To complete the massive financial transfer, the banks required the physical notarized signature of the sole trustee. He needed my signature. The vice president offered me a highly lucrative deal. He promised to wire $10 million directly into my personal offshore account the second I signed the release documents. He told me I could take the money, retire comfortably to a tropical island, and never have to deal with Tyson's massive failures ever again. I gripped the phone tightly, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. I told him I did not build this empire to sell it out to a corporate parasite who sleeps with his boss's wife. I flatly refused his money and told him I would see him in federal court to systematically dismantle his fraudulent shell company. The polite, smooth facade of the vice president instantly evaporated. His voice turned completely vicious. He warned me that I was no longer dealing with corporate lawyers or boardroom politics. He told me that the offshore money he had promised to his own violent investors was now completely frozen because of my stubborn interference. He dropped the professional tone entirely and made a direct, terrifying promise. He swore that if I did not physically sign the documents by tomorrow night, he would send his private military contractors to tear my world apart. He promised to violently burn my remaining life to the ground and ensure I never saw my grandson again. Then he slammed the phone down, leaving a dead tone echoing in my ear. The war had just escalated from legal maneuvering to physical survival. I placed the receiver back onto the wall hook. The vice president had promised fire, and I was not a man who waited blindly to be burned. I calmly walked through the cafe, running my hand along the polished mahogany bar one last time. I locked the heavy deadbolt of the front door, walked 2 blocks down the slick, rain-washed avenue, and sat in the dark cabin of my parked car. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 3 a.m, 2 unmarked black vans rolled to a silent halt in front of my building. 4 men dressed in dark tactical gear stepped out into the pouring rain. They did not bother picking the locks or trying to be discreet. They swung heavy steel crowbars, shattering the large front windows with a violent crash that echoed sharply down the empty street. I sat perfectly still and watched as they moved methodically through the dark shadows of my shop. They emptied heavy red jerry cans of industrial accelerant over the wooden floorboards, the bar counter, and the scattered tables. One of the men casually struck a bright red road flare and tossed it directly through the broken window. The explosion was instantaneous and deafening. A massive fireball blew the remaining glass out into the street, sending thick black smoke billowing into the stormy night sky. The intense heat radiated all the way to my car, melting the freezing rain into steam on my windshield. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked slowly toward the burning building, stopping on the opposite sidewalk to feel the heat against my face. My cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw an unlisted number flashing on the screen. I pressed accept and held it to my ear. It was Courtney. She was breathless, her voice dripping with venomous glee. She told me she hoped I liked the new lighting in my pathetic little coffee shop. She bragged that her new lover, the vice president, was a man of his word and that this was only a small taste of the destruction coming my way. She laughed a cruel, piercing sound that cut through the noise of the fire and demanded to know if I was finally ready to sign the trust documents now that my precious sanctuary was reduced to a pile of burning rubble. She told me to surrender immediately before they decided to pay a midnight visit to the safe house where I was keeping my grandson Leo. I stood in the freezing rain, the bright orange glow of the raging inferno reflecting vividly off the wet asphalt. I did not scream at Courtney. I did not beg for her mercy or try to negotiate. Most importantly, I did not pull my phone away from my ear to call the fire department. I simply watched the hungry flames consume the heavy wooden roof of the building. Courtney thought she was inflicting an agonizing emotional wound. She genuinely believed she was burning away decades of my most cherished memories and destroying my only safe haven in the city. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was staring at an empty, worthless shell. When Josephine first received her terminal medical diagnosis a year ago, we spent long nights in her hospital room discussing the inevitable fallout. We knew the exact moment she passed away, the corporate vultures and her greedy relatives would violently swarm the estate. I knew that my jazz cafe, my known public sanctuary and supposed weakness, would be their first physical target. 6 months ago, in the dead of night, I systematically gutted the true soul of that building. The original vintage jazz posters, the signed sheet music from Chicago legends, the priceless photographs of Josephine and me from our early startup years, and the antique brass saxophones were meticulously packed away. They were currently sitting securely in a heavily guarded, climate-controlled subterranean vault beneath a Swiss bank branch in the financial district. What was burning right in front of me was nothing but cheap replica furniture, mass-produced commercial espresso machines, and a hollowed-out structural decoy. Furthermore, the property itself was heavily insured under a highly specific corporate umbrella policy. The payout for a total malicious loss would be 10 times the actual market value of the structure. I held the phone steadily to my ear, listening to the loud crackle of the flames mixing with Courtney's arrogant laughter. I was actively recording the call on a secure secondary device hidden in my pocket, thoroughly documenting her explicit confession to an act of domestic terrorism. I let her continue her malicious rant. I let her threaten my life and my grandson, securing every single arrogant word as admissible federal evidence. I let the fire burn so fiercely that the structural integrity of the roof completely collapsed in a spectacular roaring shower of sparks. I needed the destruction to be absolute, catastrophic, and completely undeniable. Sirens finally began to wail in the distance. The neighbors had woken up and called the emergency dispatchers. I raised the phone closer to my mouth, cutting through Courtney's endless gloating with a voice as cold and heavy as the winter rain. I told her the fire was a very beautiful spectacle, but she and the vice president had just made a catastrophic, irreversible legal miscalculation. Her cruel laughter abruptly stopped. I explained to her that Josephine was a brilliant visionary who anticipated every single angle of betrayal. She knew that physical intimidation and violence would be the final desperate resort of greedy cowards who could not win in a courtroom. Therefore, Josephine had instructed Mr. Kaplan to embed a highly classified poison pill clause deep within the ironclad trust documents. The clause stated that if any of my primary properties or businesses were ever subjected to malicious destruction, arson, or hostile physical seizure, the trust would not default to the secondary beneficiaries. Instead, it triggered an immediate, automatic, and irreversible lockdown of the entire $200 million estate. The banks were legally bound by federal mandate to instantly freeze every single corporate account, void all recent stock transfers, and completely lock the Cayman Island holding companies out of the global financial system. I told Courtney that the fire she just authorized did not destroy my leverage. It acted as a massive, blazing flare specifically designed to summon the federal government. By morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would officially seize total jurisdiction over the entire company, pending a massive federal inquiry into corporate racketeering and arson. The vice president could no longer access the offshore money he had promised to his violent syndicate investors. The Russian mob would not get paid, and they would be coming directly for his head. I told Courtney to enjoy the warm glow of the fire while she still could, because her world was about to become extremely cold and terrifyingly violent. I ended the call without waiting for her response, turned my back on the burning building, and walked away into the dark street as the first fire trucks arrived on the scene. The morning sun had barely crested over the Chicago skyline when the crushing reality of the poison pill clause finally hit the luxury penthouse. The vice president, still wearing his expensive silk robe from the night before, sat at his heavy glass desk and logged into his secure Cayman Islands banking portal. He fully expected to see the massive influx of corporate funds he had successfully hijacked from Tyson during the gala. Instead, the high-definition screen flashed a glaring, terrifying red error message. The account balance was absolute zero. Every single offshore holding company, every hidden digital wallet, and every corporate routing number tied to Josephine's $200 million estate had been completely paralyzed by federal mandate. Courtney stood in the doorway holding a cup of coffee, watching the color completely drain from her new lover's face. When he explained that the arson at my cafe had triggered an automatic federal lockdown of the entire global financial network, her smug satisfaction from the night before instantly evaporated into sheer panic. The vice president violently swept his laptop off the desk, sending it crashing into the expensive plaster wall. He realized that without the liquid cash, his hostile takeover was entirely worthless. He was holding the steering wheel of a massive, heavily armored machine that had absolutely no fuel. Desperation is a powerful catalyst for severe mistakes, and the vice president refused to simply accept defeat. He looked at Courtney and quickly formulated a malicious counterattack. They needed to destroy my credibility and remove my legal standing as the sole trustee immediately. If they could convince a federal judge that I was a desperate, mentally unstable criminal, they could easily petition to have the financial freeze permanently lifted. They decided to frame me for my own destruction. The vice president picked up his phone and began making urgent calls to his highly paid fixers and corrupt local detectives. He instructed them to heavily push the narrative that a bankrupt, bitter old man had intentionally torched his own failing jazz cafe to collect a massive, fraudulent insurance payout because he was losing control of his family empire. They thought they were being incredibly resourceful, spinning a web of lies to trap me in a criminal arson investigation and strip me of my power once and for all. They were plotting to trap a ghost. While Courtney and the vice president were frantically manufacturing fake evidence in their luxury penthouse, I was already walking through the heavy revolving doors of the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Chicago. I did not bring Mr. Kaplan or a team of expensive defense attorneys to hide behind. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit lobby completely alone, wearing a perfectly pressed charcoal suit. I approached the heavy bulletproof glass of the reception desk and requested an immediate meeting with the special agent in charge of the white-collar financial crimes division. I was not intimidated by the federal badges, the weapons, or the intense security protocols. Decades ago, when I was managing the complex logistical supply lines for the transit unions, federal investigators were a constant looming threat on the South Side. I spent years studying their exact methodologies. I learned very early on that federal agents do not care about tearful family drama, emotional betrayals, or corporate gossip. They operate strictly on undeniable paper trails, hard data, and slam-dunk convictions. I sat across from a senior agent in a windowless interrogation room, the air humming with the low sound of the ventilation system. I did not complain about my son's ultimate betrayal or the burning of my beloved cafe. I simply reached into my inside jacket pocket and placed a sleek, black encrypted hard drive onto the center of the cold metal table. This was the exact same drive I had quietly loaded during Courtney's chaotic raid on my cafe days ago, securing the entire digital footprint of the company before they could even breach my back office. I looked the federal agent dead in the eye and calmly laid out the entire corporate racketeering scheme. I provided him with the precise decryption keys and the server backdoors. I explained exactly how the vice president had manipulated his chief executive officer, orchestrated a hostile takeover, and funneled millions of dollars into a hidden shell company. I told the agent that the recent arson at my property was an act of extreme corporate retaliation designed to intimidate the sole trustee into signing away the rest of the empire. I handed the federal government the murder weapon, the fingerprints, and the exact coordinates of the buried bodies, all on a silver platter. I did not ask for their protection. I simply gave them a target that was entirely too massive for them to ignore. The federal response was immediate and absolutely devastating. By noon, a convoy of black tactical vehicles surrounded the towering glass headquarters of our corporate empire. Dozens of armed federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests swarmed through the grand lobby, completely locking down the building and freezing the elevators. They bypassed the panicked receptionists and took the secure stairwells straight to the top floor. The vice president was in the middle of frantically shouting at his legal team when the heavy oak doors of his office were violently kicked open. He was slammed against his own mahogany desk, handcuffed, and publicly dragged out of the building in front of hundreds of terrified employees. But the real terror for the vice president was not the public humiliation or the impending federal prison sentence. When the forensic accountants at the field office fully decrypted my hard drive, they dug past the initial layer of corporate embezzlement. They uncovered a deeply buried financial matrix that sent shockwaves through the entire bureau. The vice president was not just stealing from Josephine's company to fund his luxurious lifestyle. He had been utilizing our pristine corporate infrastructure to systematically launder massive amounts of dirty cash for a highly organized, brutally violent Russian syndicate operating out of the East Coast. The sheer volume of the laundered money was staggering, hidden beneath layers of fake real estate acquisitions and offshore consulting fees. But the terrifying truth was that the vice president had just promised his violent investors a massive payout from the corporate takeover. And because of the poison pill clause I had successfully triggered, every single cent of the syndicate's newly cleaned money was now permanently frozen in federal escrow. The vice president was locked securely in a federal holding cell, completely out of their reach. But the syndicate did not care about the vice president anymore. They only cared about their frozen money. and they knew there was only one man left on the board with the ultimate legal authority to potentially unfreeze the trust and release their funds. The legal maneuvering was officially over, and the war for physical survival had just begun. Tyson had nowhere left to run. Stripped of his corporate title, locked out of his luxury penthouse, and hunted by the violent crypto lenders he had foolishly borrowed from, he retreated to the only place he could afford. It was a decaying, roach-infested motel on the extreme industrial outskirts of Chicago. The neon sign outside his window constantly buzzed, casting a sickly red glow over the stained carpet and the peeling wallpaper. He sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, shivering in his damp clothes, staring blankly at his useless cell phone. His life had completely collapsed in less than 48 hours. Suddenly, the flimsy wooden door of the motel room was violently kicked open, slamming hard against the drywall. Courtney stood in the doorway. She did not look like the arrogant, diamond-draped socialite from the corporate gala. Her expensive designer coat was soaked and torn, her makeup was smeared across her pale face, and her eyes darted frantically around the room like a cornered animal. Her left hand was gripped tightly around the wrist of my 8-year-old grandson, Leo. The boy looked exhausted, terrified, and deeply confused by the chaotic violence surrounding him. Courtney shoved Leo roughly into the room and slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt behind her. She marched directly up to Tyson and demanded cash. She told him the federal agents had already seized her bank accounts and raided her primary residence. But the FBI was the least of her problems. She had received a horrific phone call just an hour ago from a burner number. The Russian syndicate had realized their laundered money was permanently frozen in the corporate trust because of her lover's catastrophic failure. The mob was actively hunting down anyone connected to the vice president, and she was at the very top of their hit list. Courtney pointed a trembling finger at Tyson and issued her final venomous ultimatum. She demanded that Tyson immediately liquidate whatever hidden crypto wallets he had left secure, 2 forged passports, and arrange a private charter flight out of the country by midnight. Tyson stared at her in pathetic disbelief, stammering that he was completely broke and had absolutely no resources left. Courtney grabbed Leo by his small shoulders and pushed the weeping child toward his father. She stated with a chilling, deadpan certainty that if Tyson did not produce the money and the escape route within 2 hours, she would drive Leo directly to the Russian syndicate's front business. She threatened to leave the boy bound and gagged on their doorstep with a note stating that Tyson was the one hiding their stolen millions. She was perfectly willing to hand an innocent child over to a brutal mafia organization just to buy herself enough time to disappear into the shadows. She stood over Tyson, demanding he fix the mess he had created, using his own son as a disposable shield against the wolves. I did not bother knocking on the motel door. I used the master key card I had quietly slipped from the front desk manager 10 minutes prior. I stepped into the room bringing a blast of freezing wind with me and calmly closed the door. Courtney spun around, letting out a sharp gasp of sheer terror. Tyson scrambled backward on the bed, pressing his spine against the headboard. They looked at me as if a ghost had just walked into the room. Courtney demanded to know how I had tracked them to a cash-only motel on the edge of the city. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge her frantic questions. I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out my smartphone, displaying the blinking blue dot of the military-grade GPS tracker I had planted inside Leo's asthma inhaler days ago. I had never stopped watching my grandson. I walked methodically to the center of the cramped room, placing myself deliberately between the terrified child and the 2 monsters who claimed to be his parents. I reached into my coat again and pulled out the thick yellow medical file I had secured during the violent showdown at the psychiatric clinic. I dropped the heavy file onto the cheap laminate table. It hit the surface with a loud, authoritative slap. I looked directly at Courtney and systematically dismantled her entire extortion plan. I explained to her that threatening to hand Leo over to the Russian syndicate was a fundamentally flawed strategy. The syndicate was a highly organized criminal enterprise, not a group of mindless thugs. I told her that I had already utilized my shadow network to send a very specific message to the mob bosses on the East Coast. I had provided them with the exact surveillance photos of her illicit hotel meetings with the vice president. The syndicate already knew she was the architect of the betrayal. They knew she was the one manipulating the man who lost their money. I told her that handing Leo over would not buy her freedom. It would only give the syndicate the exact geographic location of their primary target. Furthermore, I informed her that she did not have 2 hours to plan an escape. The heavy sirens wailing in the distance were not city ambulances. I had forwarded her exact coordinates to the FBI field office the moment she crossed the city limits. Federal agents were currently surrounding the perimeter of the motel. I placed my hand firmly on the thick medical file. I told her that her game was officially over. She had absolutely no money, no leverage, no escape route, and no power left to wield. She was entirely trapped, and she was going to spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a federal penitentiary. Courtney stared at me, the crushing reality of her inescapable doom washing over her face. She looked out the window, seeing the flashing red and blue lights beginning to reflect off the wet asphalt of the parking lot. The federal agents were setting up a barricade. She was utterly defeated. But Courtney was a creature defined by pure toxic malice. If she was going down, she was determined to inflict maximum psychological destruction on her way to the bottom. She knew she could not hurt me. I was completely untouchable. So she turned her vicious gaze toward Tyson, who was currently reaching out to comfort Leo. Courtney let out a loud, hysterical laugh that echoed sharply against the cheap motel walls. She pointed a manicured finger at the yellow medical file resting on the table. She told Tyson he was the most pathetic, gullible fool she had ever met in her entire life. She ordered him to open the file and look at the blood work the corrupt clinic doctor had run on Leo before attempting to administer the heavy sedatives. Tyson slowly reached out with a trembling hand, flipping the heavy cover of the folder open. His bloodshot eyes scanned the printed laboratory results. Courtney did not wait for him to process the medical jargon. She screamed the ultimate truth right into his face. She stated loudly that Tyson had an O-negative blood type and she was A-negative. She pointed directly at the laboratory printout, declaring that Leo was definitively AB positive. The biological mathematics were absolutely impossible. Courtney smiled a wicked, terrifying smile, showing her teeth like a rabid dog. She told Tyson that he had spent 8 years raising, protecting, and fighting a brutal custody war for a child that did not even carry a single drop of his blood. She proudly announced that Leo was the biological son of the vice president. She confessed that Tyson had only ever been a convenient wallet, a stepping stone she used to access Josephine's massive corporate wealth while she built a real family with the man who eventually stole his company. The silence in the room was suffocating. Tyson dropped the medical file. The papers scattered across the stained carpet. He looked at Leo, the child he had fought me for in the hospital hallway, the child he thought was his only remaining legacy. Tyson's jaw trembled uncontrollably. A hollow, agonizing sound escaped his throat, a sound of a man whose sanity had just completely and permanently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching his chest as if his heart had been physically ripped from his ribcage, entirely broken by the ultimate betrayal. The deafening wail of federal sirens finally broke the paralyzing spell inside the motel room. The flashing red and blue lights swept violently across the stained walls, signaling that the FBI had completely locked down the perimeter. Tyson snapped out of his catatonic shock. He slowly pushed himself off the dirty carpet, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. He looked down at the 8-year-old boy standing just a few feet away. For his entire life, Tyson had viewed Leo as his ultimate possession, his legal leverage, and his guaranteed ticket to the family fortune. But looking at the child now, knowing the irrefutable truth about the vice president, Tyson did not see a son. He only saw a living, breathing monument to his own spectacular humiliation. Without saying a single word of comfort, Tyson violently shoved past the weeping child, knocking Leo to the floor. He kicked open the motel room door and sprinted out into the torrential rain. Leo scrambled to his feet, crying out for his father, and ran out into the dark parking lot after him. I followed closely behind, stepping out into the freezing storm. Tyson reached his rented sedan just as the first tactical vehicles began breaching the main entrance of the motel. Leo grabbed the wet sleeve of Tyson's suit, begging him not to leave. Tyson looked down at the terrified boy with a face utterly devoid of human emotion. He violently yanked his arm away, grabbed Leo by the shoulders, and threw the child backward onto the slick, wet asphalt. Tyson jumped into his car, slammed the heavy door shut, and aggressively stomped on the accelerator. The tires squealed against the pavement, kicking a wave of dirty rainwater directly into Leo's face as Tyson recklessly smashed through a wooden security barrier and disappeared into the chaotic night, abandoning the boy without a single backward glance. Courtney did not rush to comfort her son. Taking advantage of the distraction Tyson had just created with his reckless escape, she slipped out of the motel room and sprinted in the exact opposite direction. She did not even spare a fraction of a second to look at the child she had birthed. Her only instinct was pure, venomous self-preservation. She bolted toward the rusted chain-link fence at the rear of the property, desperately climbing over the sharp metal wire in her ruined designer clothes, fleeing into the dark, muddy industrial park to escape the closing net of federal agents. I stood in the pouring rain watching the two people who were supposed to protect this child completely discard him the moment he was no longer a valuable financial asset. Leo was left sitting in the middle of the dark parking lot, shivering violently in the freezing downpour. His small hands scraped and bleeding from the harsh asphalt. He was sobbing uncontrollably, completely shattered by the sudden, incomprehensible abandonment. I walked through the heavy rain, knelt down onto the wet pavement, and gently lifted the boy into my arms. I wrapped my heavy wool coat tightly around his trembling shoulders, shielding him from the bitter wind. He buried his face deep into my chest, gripping my shirt with a desperate, terrified strength. As I held him, the core philosophy that Josephine and I had built our entire lives upon crystallized in my mind. Blood is nothing but a biological accident. It is a completely meaningless metric used by cowards to demand unearned respect. True family is never defined by shared DNA or a matching surname. Family is forged in the absolute fire of genuine loyalty, unbreakable trust, and the conscious decision to stand your ground when the rest of the world runs away. The vice president might have provided the genetics, and Tyson might have signed the birth certificate, but neither of those pathetic men were this boy's father. I carried Leo to my vintage sedan parked safely outside the federal barricade and placed him gently into the heated passenger seat. I sat behind the steering wheel and immediately pulled out my secure phone. I did not care that it was 3 a.m. I dialed Mr. Kaplan's private number, and the ruthless attorney answered on the first ring. I gave him a rapid, highly detailed briefing of the events that had just transpired. I instructed Kaplan to wake up the most powerful federal family court judge in our extensive network immediately. I had everything I needed to execute a permanent legal strike. Both biological parents had just committed documented felonious child abandonment at an active federal crime scene. Tyson had physically assaulted the boy in front of multiple witnesses, and Courtney was currently a fleeing fugitive wanted for corporate racketeering and extortion. I ordered Kaplan to file an emergency petition for absolute permanent guardianship of the boy. I wanted Tyson and Courtney permanently stripped of all parental rights, visitation privileges, and legal claims before the sun even came up over the city. I wanted their names legally eradicated from Leo's life. Kaplan typed furiously on his keyboard, promising me the ironclad court order would be sitting on my desk by breakfast. I ended the call, turned the heater up to its maximum setting, and wiped the cold rainwater from Leo's pale face. I promised him that the monsters were permanently gone and that he was finally safe. I put the car in gear and drove away from the flashing lights of the motel, navigating through the dark, abandoned streets of the industrial district. I was heading toward a highly secure, unlisted safe house I maintained in the northern suburbs, a fortress where neither the federal government nor my treacherous family could ever reach us. The heavy rain severely reduced visibility as I drove my sedan onto the long, elevated expanse of an old industrial suspension bridge crossing the Chicago River. The steel-grated deck hummed loudly beneath my tires. The bridge was completely deserted, illuminated only by a few flickering amber streetlights. I kept my eyes locked on the road, my mind focused entirely on securing Leo's new future. But the war was far from over. Halfway across the dark bridge, a pair of blinding white halogen headlights suddenly flared to life directly in front of me, cutting through the dense storm. A massive, heavily armored black SUV had been sitting completely dark, parked entirely horizontally across the narrow roadway blocking the only exit path. I immediately slammed my foot onto the brake pedal. My vintage sedan skidded violently against the wet steel grating, the heavy tires screaming in protest as the car lurched forward, stopping just a few feet short of a catastrophic collision. Before I could throw the transmission into reverse and execute a tactical retreat, the blaring sound of aggressive air horns echoed from behind me. I looked into my rearview mirror and saw 2 more identical black SUVs speeding onto the bridge, their high beams completely blinding my rear cameras. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They slammed heavily into the rear bumper of my car, effectively boxing me in from all sides. I was completely trapped on the elevated steel structure suspended high above the freezing black waters of the river, with absolutely nowhere to run. The heavy doors of the 3 armored vehicles swung open simultaneously. 6 towering men stepped out into the pouring rain. They did not wear the cheap tactical gear of local security contractors, and they certainly did not carry federal badges. They wore expensive tailored dark suits that clung to their massive frames, and they held heavy, fully automatic weapons, completely unbothered by the severe weather. The Russian syndicate had not bothered to chase down the vice president in federal custody, and they had not wasted their time hunting Courtney through the mud. They were apex predators, and they knew exactly how to track the true source of power. They knew I was the sole trustee. They knew I was the only man on the face of the earth who possessed the legal authority and the security clearances to undo the poison pill clause and unfreeze their $200 million. The lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar running down the side of his neck, walked slowly up to the hood of my car. He raised his heavy weapon, aiming the barrel directly through the rain-slicked windshield, pointing it squarely at my chest. The fight for the corporate empire had officially ended, and the brutal fight for our physical survival had just arrived at my front door. The heavy steel door of my vintage sedan was violently yanked open. The freezing rain immediately lashed against my face as the lead enforcer grabbed me by the lapels of my heavy wool coat. He did not ask politely for my cooperation. He dragged me completely out of the driver's seat, slamming my back hard against the wet, rusted guardrail of the suspension bridge. I kept my hands perfectly visible, but I did not raise them in surrender. I looked past the barrel of the automatic weapon pressed firmly against my sternum and locked eyes with the man holding it. He was a high-ranking lieutenant for the Russian syndicate, a ruthless operator who specialized in extreme debt collection and silent executions. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and bitter cold. He told me the federal government had just locked up millions of dollars of his employer's money because I decided to play a foolish corporate game with my son's corrupt vice president. He demanded I utilize my absolute power as the sole trustee to immediately authorize the release of their frozen funds. I told him I did not control the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but he just laughed, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the roaring storm. He pressed the cold steel of the gun barrel harder into my chest, bruising my ribs. He stated that a man with my level of architectural control over the trust fund possessed the specific legal codes to bypass the federal freeze and route the cash through secondary offshore channels. He gave me exactly 24 hours to complete the transfer. If the money was not sitting securely in their accounts by 3 a.m. the following day, he promised they would not waste their time torturing me. He looked directly through the rain-slicked windshield of my car at my terrified 8-year-old grandson huddling in the passenger seat. The enforcer smiled a cold, dead smile. He promised that if I failed to deliver, they would pull the boy out of the car, tie heavy iron weights to his ankles, and drop him alive into the freezing black waters of the Chicago River while I was forced to watch. He patted my cheek with a heavy leather glove, signaled his men, and stepped back into his armored vehicle. The black SUVs reversed rapidly, disappearing into the storm and leaving me standing alone on the bridge with a terrifying ultimatum. I did not collapse onto the wet pavement in a panic. I did not scream at the dark sky or frantically dial Mr. Kaplan to beg for a legal miracle. I calmly straightened my heavy wool coat, walked back to my sedan, and climbed behind the steering wheel. I looked at Leo, who was trembling violently, his eyes wide with absolute horror. I reached over, gently squeezed his small shoulder, and told him with unwavering certainty that those men were never going to look at him ever again. I put the car in gear and drove smoothly off the bridge, navigating the winding suburban roads until we reached my secure, unlisted safe house. Once inside the heavily fortified compound, I wrapped Leo in a warm blanket, made him a cup of hot tea, and sat quietly by his bed until his exhaustion finally pulled him into a deep sleep. Then I walked into my private study, locked the heavy oak door, and went to work. The syndicate enforcer thought he had successfully intimidated a soft, wealthy corporate executive. He fundamentally misunderstood the man he had just threatened. Long before I wore tailored tuxedos to high society galas, I spent 20 years managing the underground logistical supply lines for the most powerful, corrupt transit unions in the city. You do not survive that brutal environment by capitulating to threats. You survive by building an invisible, untouchable network of highly capable individuals who owe you their lives. I did not operate in the bright light of corporate boardrooms during those years. I operated in the deep shadows, handling the violent problems that the police and the politicians refused to touch. Over the decades, I had accumulated a massive vault of unpaid debts from dangerous men who eventually rose to the very top of the city's criminal and political underworld. I opened a hidden wall safe behind a bookshelf and pulled out an encrypted satellite phone. It was completely untraceable, completely disconnected from the corporate servers. The federal agents were currently tearing apart. I spent the next 4 hours making a series of very brief, highly specific phone calls. I was calling in the ghosts. I reached out to a notorious information broker operating out of the Port Authority, a man whose entire family I had smuggled out of a war zone 15 years ago. I contacted a brilliant forensic hacker hiding in Eastern Europe, a young prodigy I had personally saved from a brutal federal prosecution. I did not ask them to protect me from the Russian syndicate. Defensive strategies are for victims. I asked them to completely dissect the vice president's hidden financial history. I knew the vice president was a greedy, arrogant parasite who thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. Men like that do not simply launder money for dangerous cartels out of the goodness of their hearts. They always take a little extra for themselves, assuming the massive volume of the cash flow will conceal their theft. I directed my shadow network to hunt down the exact discrepancies in the offshore ledgers. By the time the morning sun began to filter through the heavy blinds of my study, my network had delivered exactly what I requested. The encrypted files sitting on my secure terminal painted a beautiful, damning picture of absolute suicidal greed. The vice president had indeed been laundering tens of millions of dollars for the Russian syndicate, but he had not been transferring the full amounts. For the past 3 years, he had been systematically skimming exactly 20% off the top of every single dark transaction. He was quietly funneling the stolen syndicate money into a separate, highly encrypted digital wallet registered under Courtney's maiden name. He had stolen millions directly from the most ruthless mafia organization on the East Coast. I did not wait for the 24-hour deadline to expire. I printed the irrefutable digital ledgers, placed them inside a crisp manila envelope, and drove directly to the heavily guarded meatpacking facility that served as the syndicate's local front operation. I walked straight past the armed guards at the loading dock, demanding an immediate audience with the scarred enforcer who had threatened my grandson. When I was escorted into the freezing storage room, the enforcer smiled proudly, expecting me to hand over the banking codes to unfreeze their massive fortune. Instead, I tossed the manila envelope onto the metal table. I told him I was never going to release the $200 million. But I offered him something much more valuable than a frozen corporate account. I offered him the absolute truth about the arrogant executive who had been bleeding his organization dry for years. The enforcer slowly opened the envelope, his confident smile vanishing completely as he reviewed the flawless, undeniable proof of the vice president's massive theft. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The enforcer looked up at me, his eyes burning with a sudden terrifying rage directed entirely away from me. I told him the vice president was currently sitting in a federal holding cell downtown, believing he was perfectly safe from the mob's reach. The enforcer crushed the papers in his massive fist and told his men to prepare for an immediate, highly violent breach of the federal transport convoy. I left the freezing meatpacking facility without looking back, leaving the scarred enforcer to his violent rage. I did not care how the syndicate handled their internal betrayals. By noon, every major news network in Chicago was broadcasting breaking coverage of a massive, unprecedented firefight on the interstate. The Russian mob had executed a highly coordinated, brutal ambush on the armored federal transport convoy, carrying the vice president to a maximum security holding facility. The tactical strike was meant to be a swift execution, but the vice president was a slippery, desperate coward. In the bloody chaos of the highway shootout, he had managed to slip away from both the overwhelmed federal agents and the syndicate hitmen, vanishing into the sprawling urban grid. He was now a dead man walking, hunted simultaneously by the full weight of the United States government and the most ruthless criminal organization on the East Coast. He had absolutely no money, no allies, and no place to hide. But instead of fleeing the city in terror, his shattered mind fractured, entirely collapsing into a single blinding obsession. He blamed me for the complete destruction of his life. He knew I was the one who handed his encrypted ledgers to the mob. The next morning, I deliberately left the fortified perimeter of my safe house. I needed to draw the final poison out of the wound. I walked slowly down a busy commercial avenue in the heart of the financial district, completely exposed to the open street. The morning foot traffic was heavy, consisting of bankers and tourists wrapped in thick winter coats. Suddenly, a stolen gray sedan violently hopped the curb, crashing into a row of metal newspaper stands just 20 feet ahead of me. Pedestrians screamed and scattered in sheer panic. The The driver's side door was violently kicked open, and the vice president stumbled out onto the concrete. He looked completely feral. His expensive tailored suit was torn and stained with dried blood from the convoy ambush. He raised a heavy, unregistered handgun, his hands shaking violently with adrenaline and pure hatred, pointing the barrel directly at my chest in the middle of the crowded street. He screamed that I had ruined him, entirely ignoring the hundreds of terrified witnesses pulling out their phones. He was no longer trying to execute a corporate takeover or salvage his stolen millions. He was executing a desperate suicidal assassination in broad daylight just to silence the man who had outsmarted him. I did not dive for cover behind a parked car. I did not raise my hands and beg for my life. I stood perfectly still on the cracked sidewalk, staring down the barrel of his weapon with absolute icy calm. The vice president thought he had successfully ambushed me in a moment of vulnerability. He possessed the fatal arrogance of a man who believed he was the only predator in the jungle. He had absolutely no idea that I had meticulously orchestrated this exact confrontation. When I selected my temporary operational office in the financial district, I did not choose the building for its luxury amenities or its convenient location. I chose it specifically because it sat directly across the street from the regional headquarters of the Federal Reserve Bank. The entire intersection was blanketed by dozens of overlapping high-definition federal surveillance cameras and heavily patrolled by undercover agents. I knew the FBI had been actively monitoring my physical movements since I triggered the poison pill clause and handed them the encrypted hard drive. I also knew that the Russian syndicate was actively tracking the federal agents, hoping the FBI would eventually lead them directly to the escaped vice president. I had deliberately walked into the center of a massive, invisible crossfire, using myself as the ultimate bait to snap the trap completely shut. The vice president tightened his finger on the trigger, his eyes wide with manic desperation. He opened his mouth to deliver his final malicious threat, but the words never left his throat. A sharp, echoing crack whipped through the freezing morning air, followed instantly by a second. It was not the sound of a police revolver. It was the distinct, suppressed crack of a high-powered sniper rifle echoing from the rooftop of a commercial building 3 blocks away. The vice president's chest jerked violently forward. The unregistered handgun slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the cold concrete. He collapsed onto the sidewalk, neutralized instantly before he could even squeeze the trigger. The Russian syndicate had not missed their second opportunity. They had used my calculated public appearance to locate their stolen money, silencing the corrupt executive permanently before the federal government could take him back into custody. Within exactly 10 seconds, heavily armed undercover FBI agents swarmed the intersection from every direction, completely securing the scene. I did not run from the authorities. I calmly raised my hands and identified myself to the approaching agents. The federal surveillance cameras had flawlessly captured the entire sequence of events. The footage provided irrefutable, undeniable proof that the vice president was the violent aggressor attempting a daylight assassination, and his subsequent death was a direct result of the mob ties I had already reported. I was completely cleared of any wrongdoing, legally categorized as the surviving victim of a desperate fugitive. I had successfully used the most dangerous criminal organization in the city to permanently eliminate my greatest corporate threat, all while the federal government watched and legally sanitized the entire operation. After providing a brief, highly factual statement to the federal agents at the scene, I was escorted back to my temporary operational office by a police cruiser. The vice president was dead. Courtney was a fleeing fugitive, and the corporate empire was entirely cleansed of their toxic infection. The brutal war was supposed to be over. I walked past the lobby security desk and took the private elevator up to my suite, eager to finalize the emergency guardianship paperwork for Leo and begin repairing the massive damage to Josephine's legacy. But the moment I stepped out of the elevator, my tactical instincts flared. The heavy oak door leading to my private office was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly. The room had not been violently tossed or vandalized. Instead, it was terrifyingly quiet. I walked directly to the heavy steel biometric safe bolted to the concrete floor behind my desk. The reinforced door was swung wide open. The digital keypad had not been smashed or hacked by a brute force algorithm. The safe had been accessed using the secondary analog cryptographic bypass codes. There was only one other person on the entire planet who knew the psychological pattern I used to generate those specific numbers. It was the son I had raised. I knelt down and inspected the empty interior of the steel vault. Tyson had not come looking for loose cash or bearer bonds. He had taken the single most dangerous item I possessed. He had stolen the physical trustee master keycard, the encrypted hardware token strictly required by the International Banking Consortium to authorize massive overseas wire transfers. Without that specific card, the federal freeze was absolute. With it, a desperate man could bypass the entire legal system and instantly drain millions of dollars into untraceable accounts. Tyson, completely shattered by the revelation of his wife's betrayal and the true paternity of his son, had entirely abandoned his sanity. He knew the violent crypto lenders were still hunting him, and he knew he was facing imminent federal indictment for his commercial insurance fraud. He was using the stolen keycard to execute a final catastrophic treason against his own family. I immediately accessed the secure server logs on my desktop. The digital footprint showed Tyson had already used the stolen token to book a private, untraceable charter flight to a non-extradition country in South America, and the flight was scheduled to depart in less than 2 hours. I grabbed my heavy coat and headed straight for the door. The final confrontation with my own blood was absolutely imminent. I stopped with my hand hovering over the brass doorknob of my office. My immediate instinct was to rush down to the parking garage, tear through the chaotic Chicago traffic, and physically drag my son out of the airport. But sprinting frantically toward a crisis is exactly how desperate men make fatal mistakes. I let go of the doorknob, took off my heavy wool coat, and walked right back to my mahogany desk. 10 miles away, inside the exclusive first-class VIP lounge at O'Hare International Airport, Tyson was celebrating a premature victory. He was sitting in a plush leather chair in the furthest corner of the lounge, completely isolated from the noisy crowds in the main terminal. A crystal glass of vintage champagne rested on the small glass table next to him. His flight to Dubai was scheduled to board in exactly 45 minutes. Dubai was a strategic choice. It was a glittering playground for the wealthy, a fortress with highly complicated extradition treaties that would make it virtually impossible for federal prosecutors or the Russian syndicate to drag him back to American soil. Resting on his lap was the heavy encrypted laptop he had stolen from my secure safe, along with the physical trustee master keycard. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling with a mixture of raw adrenaline and sheer terror from the events of the past 24 hours. But a greedy smile was beginning to stretch across his face. He inserted the master keycard into the side port of the laptop and began typing the access codes. He was navigating through the complex international banking portals, preparing to execute a massive, untraceable wire transfer. He planned to drain $50 million from Josephine's trust fund directly into a numbered offshore account the very second his flight reached cruising altitude. He took a long sip of his champagne, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the commercial jets idling on the tarmac. He genuinely believed he had finally won. He thought he had outmaneuvered his treacherous wife, escaped the violent loan sharks, and completely defeated his own father. While Tyson was busy admiring the runway, I sat in the absolute silence of my study and picked up my secure satellite phone. I did not need to break the speed limit to stop him. I only needed to make 2 phone calls. I dialed the first number, reaching a senior director at the United States Department of State. 25 years ago, before this director had a corner office in Washington, he was an ambitious but deeply compromised customs inspector working the Chicago shipping ports. He had made a catastrophic error with a shipping manifest that would have landed him in federal prison. I had quietly erased the paper trail, saving his career and securing his absolute unspoken loyalty for life. I did not exchange pleasantries. I gave him Tyson's full legal name and his exact passport number. I instructed the director to immediately flag the document with a Level 1 international security alert and permanently revoke its validity. The director typed a few keystrokes on his end, and within 15 seconds, Tyson's passport was officially transformed into a useless piece of cardboard. I hung up the phone and immediately initiated the second phase of my strike. I turned to my custom-built desktop terminal. Tyson was an arrogant fool who fundamentally misunderstood the technology he had stolen. He thought possessing the physical laptop and the master keycard gave him absolute control over the server. But I was the architect who built the network. The laptop he was currently holding was not just a portal to the trust fund, it was a digital bear trap. I accessed the root command console from my desktop and remotely locked the stolen laptop's motherboard. I froze the banking transfer protocol, instantly rendering the access codes completely dead. But simply stopping the theft was not enough. Tyson had crossed the final line by stealing from his own family to save his pathetic skin. He required a permanent lesson. Using my secure backdoor access, I initiated a rapid, heavily encrypted data transfer directly into the hard drive of the laptop Tyson was currently holding on his lap. I flooded the machine with highly classified, unredacted federal surveillance files. These were the exact same sensitive documents the FBI had used to raid the vice president's shell company's files containing highly classified grand jury testimony and active undercover operative identities. By the time my progress bar hit 100%, Tyson was no longer just a desperate man trying to steal corporate funds. He was in direct possession of stolen federal intelligence, making him an immediate threat to national security. I powered down my terminal, put my heavy wool coat back on, and called for a private car. It was time to go to the airport and watch the trap snap shut. I walked past the crowded security checkpoints at O'Hare International, flashing a high-level corporate access badge that allowed me to bypass the long lines. I moved with quiet purpose through the bustling terminal and pushed open the frosted glass doors of the VIP lounge. I spotted Tyson immediately. He was frantically slamming his fist against the keyboard of the stolen laptop, his face flushed with panic as the screen remained frozen on a glaring red error message. I walked over and pulled out the chair directly across from him. The heavy thud of my boots made him look up. The remaining color drained entirely from his face. He slammed the laptop shut, looking around the lounge like a trapped rat preparing to sprint toward the boarding gates. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm. I told him he was not going to Dubai. I informed him that his passport had just been digitally incinerated by the State Department and his boarding pass was absolutely worthless. Tyson snarled at me, his voice shaking with furious desperation. He declared that I could not stop him grabbing the handle of the laptop bag and shoving his way past the glass table. But as he took his first frantic step toward the exit, the heavy glass doors of the VIP lounge were violently shoved open. 6 federal agents wearing tactical vests and windbreakers clearly marked with TSA and Homeland Security insignias swarmed into the room. They did not give Tyson a chance to speak. They slammed him forcefully against the polished marble wall, kicking his legs apart and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The lead agent snatched the laptop bag from Tyson's trembling fingers. Tyson began screaming hysterically, begging me to tell them it was just a corporate dispute and that he had a right to the computer. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, expecting me to shield him from the law one last time. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and looked my son dead in the eye. I told the federal agents that the man in their custody had stolen that specific laptop from my secure safe and the hard drive contained highly sensitive active federal case files. Tyson's jaw dropped as he finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of what he was holding. He was not being arrested for corporate theft. He was being dragged away for possessing stolen federal evidence, a crime that carried a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. I watched in absolute silence as they marched my screaming son out of the lounge, permanently erasing him from my life. The mud from the industrial park had barely dried on Courtney's ruined designer coat when the United States Marshals finally caught up with her. She had not made it very far. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, her wealthy lover, or her luxury vehicles, she was reduced to hiding in a filthy public restroom at a Greyhound bus terminal on the edge of the city. When they dragged her into the federal building in handcuffs, she looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant socialite who had demanded the keys to my empire. She looked like a cornered, terrified animal. She was facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary for corporate racketeering, financial fraud, extortion, and fleeing an active crime scene. Even worse, she knew the Russian syndicate was actively hunting down anyone connected to their stolen millions. The federal detention center was the only place keeping her alive. Desperation forces rats to bite, and Courtney immediately attempted to chew her way out of the trap by offering the federal prosecutors the only massive target she could think of. She offered them me. 3 days later, I walked into a sterile, windowless deposition room deep inside the federal courthouse. Mr. Kaplan walked beside me carrying his heavy leather briefcase. Sitting across the long mahogany table was Courtney, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, her wrists shackled to a metal ring bolted to the floor. Next to her sat a visibly exhausted public defender. On our left sat the lead federal prosecutor and 2 FBI special agents, the recording device in the center of the table glowing with a steady red light. Courtney had requested a proffer session, a formal meeting to negotiate a highly coveted plea deal in exchange for devastating testimony against a bigger fish. She took a deep breath, looked directly at the federal agents, and began to spin a massive, intricate web of absolute fiction. She claimed that I was the true mastermind behind the entire corporate embezzlement scheme. She testified that I had used my brutal history with the Chicago transit unions to force the vice president into laundering money for the mob. She painted a pathetic picture of herself as a terrified, abused mother completely trapped by a ruthless father-in-law who threatened to kill her 8-year-old son if she did not comply. She even claimed that I had deliberately burned down my own jazz cafe to collect a fraudulent insurance payout and destroy the physical evidence of my crimes. She wept on command. She let her voice tremble perfectly. She begged the federal prosecutors for immunity and witness protection, swearing on her child's life that I was the monster pulling all the strings. For 2 agonizingly long hours, I sat directly across from her and did not utter a single syllable. I did not shake my head in disgust. I did not interrupt her to defend my honor. I executed the core philosophy of the silent adjustment. When an enemy is eagerly digging their own grave, you never interrupt them to ask if they need a better shovel. You simply stand back and let them dig until the hole is completely inescapable. I watched the federal prosecutors taking furious notes, occasionally glancing over at me with deep suspicion. Courtney was giving them the performance of a lifetime, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed like the agents were actually buying her manufactured victimhood. Finally, she finished her elaborate story, wiped a manufactured tear from her cheek, and looked across the table at me with a microscopic, venomous smirk. She genuinely thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated the federal government into doing her dirty work. Mr. Kaplan slowly unclasped the brass latches of his briefcase. The loud clicks echoed sharply in the quiet room. He did not raise his voice or engage in dramatic courtroom theatrics. He pulled out a thick stack of heavily encrypted digital transcripts and a high-capacity flash drive. He slid the documents across the polished table toward the lead prosecutor. Kaplan calmly explained that he was not going to waste the federal government's time arguing against a desperate fiction. Instead, he was going to dismantle her entire testimony using her own undeniable digital footprint. Kaplan opened his own folder and began reading directly from the secure server logs I had extracted days ago. Courtney had just testified under oath that on October 14th I had violently threatened her into attending a secret meeting with the vice president. Kaplan read a text message Courtney had sent to the vice president on that exact date. The text explicitly detailed her booking a luxury hotel suite, ordering expensive champagne, and eagerly mocking Tyson's pathetic ignorance while they planned their corporate takeover. The color began to rapidly drain from Courtney's face. Kaplan did not stop. He pulled out the audio file we had secured from the corrupted psychiatric clinic. Courtney had claimed I orchestrated the plot to lock Leo in a ward. Kaplan pressed play on his laptop. The clear, high-definition audio of Courtney explicitly bribing the corrupt doctor to heavily sedate her own son filled the deposition room. In her own voice, she stated clearly that she needed the boy drugged specifically to bypass my legal authority as the trustee. Kaplan methodically dissected every single lie she had meticulously constructed over the past 2 hours. He cross-referenced her sworn statements with offshore bank routing numbers, private charter flight logs, and hotel security footage. He built an ironclad, impenetrable wall of hard data that completely suffocated her false narrative. The federal prosecutor slowly closed his notebook and set his pen down. The FBI agents stopped looking at me and turned their cold, furious glares directly toward Courtney. The lead prosecutor leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. He informed Courtney that the proffer session was officially terminated. He coldly explained that lying to federal agents during a recorded negotiation was not just a minor misstep. It was a severe felony charge of perjury and obstruction of justice, carrying its own massive mandatory prison sentence on top of the racketeering charges she was already facing. He told her the immunity deal was entirely dead, the witness protection request was denied, and the government was going to prosecute her to the absolute fullest extent of the law. The realization hit Courtney like a physical blow to the chest. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked around the sterile room, realizing she had completely exhausted her final lifeline. She had no money, no husband, no wealthy lover, no mob protection, and now she had completely alienated the federal government. The walls of the federal courthouse were physically closing in on her. Her public defender leaned over, placing a hand on her arm, and quietly whispered that she needed to stop talking and accept a full guilty plea immediately before the prosecutor added more charges. That soft whisper was the final catalyst that completely shattered her fragile sanity. Courtney let out a feral, blood-curdling shriek. She did not lunge at me across the table. She snapped her head toward the only person sitting within her immediate reach. She grabbed the heavy glass water pitcher resting on the table with both hands, raised it high above her head, and violently smashed it directly into the side of her own lawyer's face. The heavy glass shattered on impact, sending water and jagged shards flying across the mahogany table. The public defender screamed in agony, collapsing out of his chair and hitting the floor hard. Total chaos erupted inside the small room. The two FBI special agents vaulted over the table, tackling Courtney to the ground before she could grab a broken piece of glass. They pinned her face down against the carpet, screaming tactical commands while she thrashed wildly beneath them, kicking and spitting like a rabid animal. I remained perfectly seated in my leather chair, watching the pathetic, violent end of the woman who had tried to destroy my family. She had not just perjured herself. By violently assaulting an officer of the court inside a federal building, she had permanently sealed her own fate. She was never going to see the outside of a prison wall again. The federal marshals dragged her screaming out of the room, leaving a trail of shattered glass and spilled water behind. The legal battlefield was completely cleared of enemies. Now only the final sentencing hearing remained to permanently secure the $200 million trust and completely formalize my guardianship of Leo. The silent adjustment was nearly complete. 2 weeks after the violent chaos in the deposition room, the massive wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung open for the final time. I walked into the grand courtroom wearing the same bespoke midnight blue tuxedo I had worn to Tyson's disastrous corporate gala. I took my seat at the heavy mahogany plaintiff table alongside Mr. Kaplan. The gallery behind us was completely empty, cleared by judicial order to maintain absolute privacy for the sensitive family matters about to be permanently resolved. A heavy, absolute silence hung in the cold, air-conditioned room. The heavy side door opened and 2 armed United States Marshals escorted Tyson and Courtney into the courtroom. The transformation was absolutely staggering. They were entirely stripped of their expensive corporate armor. Tyson was not wearing his custom-tailored velvet jacket or his expensive Italian leather shoes. Courtney was not draped in diamonds or wearing a pristine silk blouse. They were both dressed in identical, brightly colored, heavily starched county jail jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were secured with heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished hardwood floor as they shuffled toward the defense table. They looked gaunt, exhausted, and completely broken by the brutal reality of the federal detention center. The presiding judge, a stern, unforgiving man with decades of experience dismantling corporate fraud, took his seat at the high bench. He looked down at my son and his treacherous wife with absolute disgust. Tyson leaned forward, his hands shaking violently as they rested on the defense table. He practically threw himself on the mercy of the court. He wept openly, begging the judge for leniency. He claimed he was a victim of severe emotional manipulation, arguing that the deceased vice president and his manipulative wife had coerced him into liquidating the corporate assets. He cried about his ruined reputation and pleaded for just a small fraction of his mother's massive inheritance, insisting that Josephine would never want her only biological child left completely destitute on the streets. Courtney immediately interrupted him, her voice shrill and desperate. She ignored the heavy bandage covering the public defender's face sitting next to her and tried to play the victim card one last time. She begged the judge for a massive financial settlement from the trust to secure her future, screaming that she had been trapped in a loveless marriage and was only trying to protect herself. They stood before the highest legal authority in the district, entirely stripped of their dignity, begging for scraps of the very empire they had actively tried to burn to the ground. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge. I knew exactly how this legal theater would end because Josephine and I had meticulously choreographed this exact sequence of events before she even passed away. Josephine possessed a brilliant, terrifying foresight. She knew that if Tyson ever attempted to forcefully break the trust or commit crimes against the estate, simply cutting him off would trigger years of endless, grueling probate litigation. We needed a definitive, lethal legal maneuver that would instantly sever his access without any possibility of a drawn-out appeal. Mr. Kaplan stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked confidently to the center podium. He did not present a passionate, emotional argument. He simply opened his leather briefcase and handed the bailiff a single, heavily notarized legal document to pass up to the judge. Kaplan announced that Tyson had officially violated the extreme punitive clauses embedded deep within Josephine's final will. By committing federal crimes against the corporate entity, stealing classified federal intelligence from my safe, and attempting to flee the country, Tyson had triggered the ultimate asset diversion protocol. Kaplan looked directly at Tyson and delivered the final crushing blow. He stated that the primary trust holding the $200 million estate was officially and permanently dissolved. However, the money was not reverting to the state, and it was certainly not being divided among the family. The entire $200 million was instantly and irrevocably transferred into an ironclad generation, skipping protective and educational trust. The sole uncontested beneficiary of this new financial fortress was my 8-year-old grandson, Leo. Furthermore, the document named me as the permanent, unremovable executor and guardian of that specific trust. I had absolute total control over the empire until Leo turned 35 years old. Tyson stared at Kaplan, his jaw dropping in sheer horror as the words echoed in the large room. He realized he had just been completely legally erased from his own mother's legacy. Kaplan then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded piece of paper. He handed it to the bailiff, who placed it directly on the table in front of Tyson. It was the exact same $20 bill Tyson had mockingly flicked across the table at me weeks ago. Kaplan informed the court that according to the final codicil of the will, this specific $20 bill represented the absolute entirety of Tyson's inheritance. There were no hidden accounts, no secondary properties, and no monthly stipends. Tyson was officially and permanently worth exactly $20. The judge reviewed the document, signed his name with a heavy stroke of his pen, and slammed his wooden gavel down. But the financial execution was only the first part of the checkmate. The judge shifted his focus to the thick stack of child welfare documents I had submitted. He looked down at Tyson and Courtney with eyes as cold as absolute zero. He declared that their documented history of severe child abandonment, medical abuse, and extreme criminal negligence demonstrated a profound, irredeemable moral failure. He stated that neither of them possessed the basic human decency required to raise a child. Without a single moment of hesitation, the judge signed the final decree permanently terminating all of their parental rights. He legally stripped them of their title as parents, erasing their names from Leo's future entirely, and granted me full permanent and uncontested legal adoption of my grandson. The realization of their total, absolute destruction finally shattered whatever fragile remnants of sanity Tyson and Courtney had left. Tyson let out a primal, agonizing roar. He lunged across the defense table, his heavy waist chains rattling violently, and grabbed Courtney by the collar of her orange jumpsuit. He screamed right into her face, blaming her for the affair, the Russian syndicate, and the complete loss of his son and his fortune. Courtney fought back with vicious, feral energy. She clawed at his face with her chained hands, screaming that he was a pathetic, weak coward who deserved to rot in a federal cell for the rest of his miserable life. They tore at each other right there in the middle of the federal courtroom, two venomous snakes cannibalizing each other in a pit of their own making. The United States Marshals immediately swarmed the defense table. They ripped my son and my former daughter-in-law apart, pinning them aggressively against the heavy wooden benches. The judge angrily ordered the bailiffs to remove them from his courtroom immediately. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff table and watched the marshals drag them violently toward the heavy exit doors. They were kicking, screaming, and spitting venom at each other, their voices echoing loudly down the marble hallway even after the doors slammed shut. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I slowly picked up my briefcase, straightened my tie, and walked out of the courtroom through the private judge's chambers. The empire was completely secure. The parasites had been permanently exterminated. I was finally going home to my grandson. 6 months after the heavy doors of the federal courtroom slammed shut on my former family, I found myself standing in the middle of a familiar charred footprint on the south side of Chicago. The bitter winter had finally broken, giving way to the crisp, sharp winds of early spring. I stood on the exact spot where my espresso machine used to sit, surrounded by the blackened, skeletal remains of my old jazz cafe. The smell of ash and burnt timber still lingered in the air, but it no longer smelled like destruction to me. It smelled like a clean slate. I unrolled a thick, heavy set of architectural blueprints across a makeshift plywood table, weighing the corners down with pieces of broken brick. I was not just rebuilding the sanctuary Courtney had maliciously ordered to be burned to the ground. I was expanding it. The massive insurance payout from the corporate umbrella policy, combined with the unrestricted liquid capital from the newly secured trust, provided me with limitless resources. The new building would be 3 stories high, featuring a state-of-the-art acoustic lounge on the main floor and a dedicated youth music academy on the upper levels. While the construction crews began pouring the fresh concrete foundation beneath my boots, The people who had tried to bury me were finding out exactly how hard the bottom of the barrel truly was. The vice president was completely erased from the board. After the Russian syndicate neutralized him in the middle of the financial district, his offshore shell companies were dismantled by federal auditors, and his name was quietly scrubbed from the corporate history books. He died an arrogant thief on a cold sidewalk, and the world simply moved on without him. Courtney was currently sitting in a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell in a maximum security federal women's correctional facility in Aliceville. Stripped of her expensive silk blouses, her diamonds, and her wealthy lovers, she was entirely unremarkable. Her beauty was rapidly fading under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her arrogant, manipulative tongue had already earned her severe beatings from the hardened inmates she was now forced to live with. But the most profound adjustment belonged to my son. Tyson, the man who had worn custom velvet jackets and demanded the keys to a $200 million empire, was now officially inmate number 84209. He was serving his mandatory 20-year sentence in the Marion, United States Penitentiary. He had no access to unregulated crypto markets or luxury VIP airport lounges. His daily reality was strictly confined to the prison kitchens. The boy who had scoffed at my jazz cafe and called me a parasite was now spending 14 hours a day scrubbing industrial aluminum pots and mopping floors slick with grease for 32 cents an hour. In the first few months, he had frantically tried to use his one weekly phone call to reach my secure line. He sent dozens of pathetic, weeping letters written on cheap prison paper, begging me for an appeal lawyer, begging for a fraction of his inheritance, begging for my forgiveness. I never answered a single call. I never opened a single letter. I simply handed the unopened envelopes directly to my security team to be tossed into the incinerator. There was absolutely no room in my new life for the ashes of my past. My new life was entirely dedicated to the only bloodline that actually mattered. Leo and I had permanently moved into the secure, heavily fortified estate in the northern suburbs. The terrified, shattered 8-year-old boy I had scooped up from the freezing asphalt of that dirty motel parking lot was slowly beginning to heal. But healing a child requires much more than simply providing them with a massive trust fund and a safe house. It requires extreme, unyielding presence. I looked at the mistakes Josephine and I had made with Tyson. We had been too busy building a financial empire, substituting genuine parenting with expensive sports cars and unlimited credit cards. We had created a monster because we provided a massive safety net without ever installing a moral compass. I was absolutely determined to break that generational curse. I was not going to raise another entitled parasite. I started by taking the rusted brass saxophone mouthpiece I had salvaged from the decoy safe before the fire. I had it professionally restored and attached it to a beautiful beginner-level alto saxophone. I gave it to Leo on his 9th birthday. I did not just hire expensive private tutors to teach him how to play. I sat with him in the study every single evening. I taught him how to read the sheet music. I taught him that making a beautiful sound requires extreme discipline, rigorous breath control, and endless patience. When his fingers bled from pressing the heavy brass keys, I did not let him quit. I told him that the pain was simply weakness leaving his hands, and that nothing of true value is ever acquired without enduring the friction of hard work. I established strict, unbreakable boundaries inside our home. Despite the fact that Leo was the sole beneficiary of a $200 million fortune, his daily life did not reflect it. He attended a rigorous preparatory school, but he rode the standard bus like everyone else. He had daily chores. He learned how to wash his own clothes, cook basic meals, and maintain the grounds of the estate. When he wanted a new video game console, he had to earn the money by doing manual labor around the property. I was teaching him the exact value of a single dollar, ensuring he understood the heavy weight of the legacy he would eventually inherit. People in my peripheral social circles often whispered about my absolute refusal to visit Tyson in federal prison. Society possesses a deeply toxic obsession with unconditional forgiveness when it comes to family members. They believe that shared DNA mandates infinite second chances. I rejected that weak philosophy entirely. To forgive Tyson, to send him commissary money, or offer him false hope would be a massive disrespect to the trauma he inflicted upon Leo. It would be a profound insult to the memory of Josephine and the empire she built. Forgiveness is a gift reserved for those who make honest mistakes. Treason, however, is a calculated choice, and the penalty for treason is permanent exile. I had surgically removed the cancer from our family tree, and I refused to invite the disease back into my home. My loyalty was strictly reserved for the boy who was currently sitting in the next room practicing his scales on the saxophone with absolute determination. A year later, the grand opening of the new jazz cafe arrived. It was 6 a.m, 2 hours before the heavy mahogany doors would officially open to the public. The smell of fresh pine, expensive leather, and dark roasted Ethiopian coffee beans filled the massive 3-story acoustic lounge. I stood completely alone behind the long, polished bar. The morning sun pierced through the tall, bulletproof glass windows, casting long, golden shadows across the pristine hardwood floors. I looked around at the fortress I had built from the ashes of my enemies, feeling a profound, heavy sense of peace. I thought about Josephine. She had known the exact limits of our son's character. She had known that the moment she died, the greed would completely consume him. Leaving me that $20 bill was not just a signal. It was her handing me the scalpel and trusting me to cut the rot out of our life. I picked up a ceramic mug and poured myself a single cup of black coffee. The steam rose quietly into the cold morning air. I looked at my reflection in the polished espresso machine. I was not a victim. I was the architect of the silent adjustment. The world is full of loud, arrogant fools who believe that screaming and throwing tantrums equates to actual power. But true power operates differently. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't scream or throw tantrums. Justice is a silent adjustment. It's the quiet sweep of a broom clearing out the trash so the foundation can hold. I took a slow sip of the dark, bitter coffee. I set the mug down and ran my hand over the center of the bar counter. Embedded deeply into the solid mahogany wood protected beneath an inch of bulletproof crystal-clear resin was the original crisp $20 bill. It was the anchor. It was the undisputed proof that the empire had finally been secured. I turned off the overhead light, walked toward the front entrance, and unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt. It was time to get to work. The final lesson I took from this ordeal is that true wealth is never measured by bank balances or corporate titles. True wealth is your ability to remain completely calm while chaos surrounds you. Greed always blinds people to the quiet strength of those they foolishly underestimate. My son believed he could inherit my power without earning my resilience. He learned the hard way that a fortress built on betrayal will inevitably collapse. If you have ever had to cut toxic family out of your life to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below. Like and subscribe.